Just video.
Just video, but it's still video.
Yeah,
There it is.
So for those of you that just came in, if you go to jrodesign.com/downloads, today we'll be using the files that are in this folder right here. It's actually a zip file, the cs03.zip. Just right-click on that, do a save target as, and then it's a zip file. So you guys just go ahead and uncompress it on somewhere on your computer.
And you can put that part on the video too, right? So when I go to find it, I won't forget what I'm on.
Yeah, it's on. We're recording right now.
Thank you. I don't want to miss a thing.
So while everyone's kind of getting that file, basically what I want to cover today is kind of an array of things, of course, but we've got a number of topics to still cover, and one of them that I wanted to get into, because it's my understanding you guys will be doing some structural modeling or something with structure in the upcoming week.
Oh yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to actually cover. So last time we did a workshop, I did more complex structures, but I want to actually go over the structural tubes and actual steel members and wood and concrete, those type of things, and the structural tools that actually come with Revit, where we can kind of model with those, and we have we don't have to do all that generic modeling and those mass models that we were doing in the last class. We can actually use some of the things right out of the box. I also want to cover how to print. This computer lab finally got a Adobe PDF printers on it. It took quite a while to eventually get that on there. So now we can actually print right out of Revit to PDF and be able to send it to a plotter, or you can put it in your documents, your InDesign files and whatever else. So I want to go over that. Also, it's my understanding you guys have been doing some detailing as well. Oh yes, all right. I want to show a couple quick methods of how you could actually detail over on top of your model right in Revit, so that you don't have to extract it to CAD. I assume everyone's probably been working in CAD on that. So kind of show some of the ideology of what it means to actually model and then draft on top of the model. And that's really the process of working through Revit is, at some point you get to the point where you're no longer modeling anymore and you're drawing the details on top of the model. And the reason for that is, you're not going to model every little bolt and every little piece as you go through your model. So at certain times you're going to draft over on top of it.
If they've made AutoCAD drawings of these sections, can they import that, or would that be a kind of unnatural marriage to their model?
You can, if you actually have like a CAD section that you've already done or some kind of details, you can actually bring that into Revit, and you could either try to draw on top of it again, or you can kind of keep it in there if you want, but it'll lose some connection with the model if it's not a Revit object. But
Gotcha.
I can kind of cover that.
Yeah.
I do want to also touch on interior rendering, exterior rendering, try to get as much as I can on that, and just real quick basics on materials. And then I do have follow-up videos that I've sent you guys before, but you guys can watch again. And if we really have time, I do want to, one thing we haven't introduced yet in these workshops is how to work with the stairs and also the railing tools. Those is basically structures, stairs, and railings are kind of the big components that we haven't gone over yet that I would like to touch on. So if everyone can make sure you got Revit open, and we're going to go ahead and get started here. Again, if you download that file, just go ahead and right-click. If you're in Internet Explorer, you can do a save target as, place it somewhere on your, somewhere on your computer where you can find it later. And once you download it, it shouldn't take too long to download. I'm going to download it right here real quick. Everyone knows how to extract a zip file, I hope. If not, basically all you have to do is get, find a zip file and you right-click on it. Let's see if I can even find one here. So you can you right-click on it and then tell it to, let's see, where is that? Extract all. And when you do that, it'll extract all that information into a folder. Or the other thing is you can just double left-click in it and then copy and paste all this stuff into, out of that zip file. So those are the two ways to get that out of there. In order to get into that file when we're in Revit, we're going to have those extracted. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and let's start up a architectural template. And I first want to just kind of draw some basic, we're going to make a basic building real quick. I want to show you how to do some color fill schemes, and then also how we can start dragging and dropping this stuff onto a piece of paper and printing. So just in level 1, you don't have to be too fancy here. But I'm just going to click on wall, and I'm just going to use whatever wall pops up, which is the 8-inch wall. And I'm just going to draw like an office block, kind of like we did at the first, one of the first classes. And I'm just going to copy this down a couple times. Oops. And remember, you can make those dimensions and equal. Just kind of making an office block. And then I'm going to make just a couple more other rooms off to the right here. And again, I'm not too concerned about the 3D aspect of this at the moment. And we'll just make it's kind of a bigger block over here, separated by 2. So nothing fancy. Let's say this is your building. So you've got your plan, and essentially we've got all these different spaces that are part of your building. I'm not going to put in all the details like the doors and windows or anything like that at the moment. But what I want to show is a lot of times when you're presenting your work, especially when we're in maybe even in a design phase or even like in schematic design or design development. At times you might want to, instead of labeling all these rooms so that this is an office and you would put in all these room names, sometimes you like to color code your plans and place them on a sheet with a legend. A lot of times you have to take this out of some program and then put it into like Photoshop in order to do that type of work, or if you're in CAD you're doing some fill hatch patterns and things like that. But what you can do in Revit is if you have spaces, there's this little option up here under architecture called a room. And when you click on room and you start to hover inside of a space, you can see you get this like X kind of box that starts to hover in there. And you can either tag on placement. So when I tag on placement, I'm highlighting that. It's basically putting in a room tag with a room number and all this stuff that's in there, which that's good for construction documents and that type of thing. But when you're presenting especially for like studio and so on, you probably don't want those tags in there kind of messing up your actual drawing and look. So I'm going to delete the tag, but I'm going to keep the room in there. And when you hover over that space, you can start to see where you can left click on that room. And basically all a room is, it's basically this big volume. It's a blank space that is filled into Revit. But off to the left when you select the room, so I have to kind of hover over sort of the edges. Eventually you can find the X. And when I click on that and this turns blue, off to the left a room has a bunch of different parameters. It'll tell you the room area. It tells you the perimeter. Those two things right there are going to be kind of key when you guys start doing your code analysis. So one thing to keep in mind, you might want to start putting rooms in your project.
That's today. Sorry.
Oh, was it today?
Yeah, but keep going.
Okay.
This is great.
Well, if you want to redo it, it might be a way to check it. But the other part here is you got room number and then also room name, and then there's all these other information here that usually go along with like a room finish schedule. But what I'm going to do is where it says name, let's give this big space a name, and we'll call it like let's just call it auditorium. Pretend that's like a big seminar room, or actually a big auditorium like we have here at the college. And I'm going to place a couple more rooms, and I'm just going to I'm going to turn off this tag on placement. All you have to do is toggle that. I'm going to go ahead and place the rest of these rooms. And these two down at the bottom, so I'm going to left click on that one and then hold in the control key and left click on this one. I'm going to give both of these the same name. Let's call those seminar rooms. And then of course the little office block here. We'll call all of these offices. Now basically by putting the room into these spaces, that room is now kind of the BIM component of the space. So you now have the ability to, if you were to change any part of these rooms, obviously all this data is going to update. But if you're extracting all this data, it'd always be connected with your model as that room changes. Now one thing you'll notice before I do the color fill scheme is that when I try to place a room and it's outside of kind of an enclosed space, I don't have the option, when I click and place it, it tells me right there, room is not in a properly enclosed region. So sometimes you might have rooms that might have a open, kind of like an open space going into a corridor or like a lobby, but you want to be able to color that or label it. So there's another option here called room separation lines. So next to room, there's room separator. And that's basically just drawing kind of the boundaries of a space, but it's not really going to draw, it's basically drawing a 2D line. And I'm just kind of enclosing that. And now once I kind of close that off with those lines, essentially I have that space available to program. So when I did that, I could actually call this, maybe this is the lobby, and I'll label that. Now it'll also show you those lines, but again, remember, if you type in VG on your keyboard and then look under model categories, there's a visibility graphics for lines, and I can expand that, and you'll find a line type called room separator. And if you just uncheck that, those lines will go away. The other way to do that is you could just right click on one of those lines and say hide in view and select category, and that'll kind of get rid of those as well. But again, that room will still stay there. So now that we have kind of information and data that's part of the model, that talks about these rooms, what we can do is in this particular view, we can apply what's called a color fill scheme so that you can actually present this with a legend and everything. And you'll notice that if you go into the floor plan and kind of click on level 1, because that's the one that we've been drawing in, look to the left under the properties. There's this option here called color scheme, and it's set to none. If we click on that box, we can now get this dialog box that pops up, and you can pick a category under schemes. There's spaces, rooms, and everyone's favorite HVAC zones. I guess that's mainly for our mechanical group. But anyway, you're going to go ahead and pick on the rooms, because that's the room. We've basically placed a room space, and we want to be able to extract the data from that. And then it's asking you what basically parameter do you want to assign a color to. And since we've been dealing with names, I'm going to click on rooms and then click on name. And it will generate a fill scheme, just by random. Later on you can change these particular colors. But if you look at the value is actually the name of the room as you actually put it into that space. So then when I click OK, you now have your color fill scheme for that plan. And again, if you want to change those colors, you can just go back and you can click on the color tab and put in whatever custom color you want. But as you add more and more rooms and spaces, or if I were to, for instance, divide this big space, notice when I divide that big space, the room is going to end up in one of the enclosed regions. So I'm going to go ahead and place another one. And because this one is a different name, it's going to be a different color. Then after that, what we can do is go under, annotate, under the up at the top. And there's this little option here to the right called color fill legend. We can just place that onto your sheet, and now you've got a legend that talks about all the different parts and pieces of your model. So basically, I know a lot of people like to do this for their presentations. One limitation to this. Like a fire alarm, huh? Are they testing today?
This could be real.
All right, I'm going to hit resume, so we should be right back where we left off. Try to remember what I was about to do. So we placed we got the color fill, we got the legend. Now I want to talk about actually what to do with these drawings, once you have them and you want to output them out of Revit so that you can actually print, the PDF, and then also print to a plotter if you wanted to or whatever. This is going to be the same concept for any drawing that you do in Revit. So actually, let's go ahead and, I've got the floor plan. Let's go ahead and make a section. Of course, this isn't going to be pretty, but we'll make a section drawing in here as well. That's basically all we have. And then we should have elevations that are automatically generating. So not a whole lot to look at, but one thing is, when you've got your sections, you can select that section line, and I think we've gone over this before, but you can adjust once you select the section line, how far you see in that section. So if you want to see all the way to the other side of your model, or if you just want to be able to see like a little part of it and not see everything beyond, you can adjust your kind of clip boundary there. The other thing is you can click this little lightning bolt that's in the middle, and that will break the section marker so that you don't have it, kind of going through your model or going through your drawings. The other thing that you can do is at the very end of your section markers, when you select that, you have this little circle. It looks kind of like the recycling symbol, but if you keep clicking that, it cycles through different options of how to look at your section. So if you don't want to see this other tag here, this is typically what you'd see in construction documents where it'll tell you what page this ends up on. You might just want to see the tail later on, or you can also hide that if you don't want to see those. Anyway, we've got the section, I've got some elevations, and we've got these plans. In order to print in Revit, you basically need to set up a sheet. So it's just going to be like an InDesign where you set up whatever size sheet that you want. But the way that it works is it's set up as a view. So if you click on view, you have this option here to make a sheet. And when you click on that, it's going to ask you, which title block do you want to use. And typically everything in Revit is going to have a title block, but I'm going to show you how to get around that. Let's just pick the 30 by 42 that comes with it, and you go ahead and click OK. I'm going to repeat that. Go to view, and then click on sheet. And then you're going to choose the E1 30 by 42 option. Now it's going to load up basically what you would expect to see from an office, kind of a standard title block from Autodesk Revit. But what we're going to do for this class and what I typically talk about here at the college is basically all you need is the exterior boundary of the sheet. So this exterior boundary is what's going to define the overall size of your page. So in order to do that, if I click on this particular title block, notice it says Edit Family up at the top. Title blocks are actually, when you click on that, it takes you into the title block family. So basically these are kind of an annotation family that is part of Revit. What I'm going to do is select everything except for the boundaries, and I'm going to hit delete. So this boundary line, if you click on it, this width is 3 foot 6 inches, so 42 inches, and the height there is 2 foot 6, so 30 inches. So this is the actual size of the sheet that you would want to actually print on. So if you wanted to do some large piece of paper, that's 100 inches long by whatever, you would actually draw, and all you have to do is go, you'd probably just modify this. You could actually type in, let's say 100 inches, and let's say that's your paper that you're going to eventually plot on. So basically you're always going to make whatever size sheet that you're going to plot on. So if you're going to do 11 by 17, you want to change that to truly be 11 inches by 17 inches and so on. But for now, 30 by 42 is usually a good one to stick with. Yes?
So if we've modified this component to be the size that we actually want, how do we save that so that it's an option in the menu later on?
Right. So what I would do is you could do once you make that modification, let's go ahead and do a file save as in family, and then you can give it whatever name you want. So I kept this one as a 30 by 42. I'll just call it whatever, in class or in workshop, and I'm going to save it somewhere that I can eventually get to it. So whatever modifications you make, and you could, if you really wanted to, you could make it parametric. You could make all these tags parametric and then do family types for all your different sheet sizes. But for right now, the easiest way is just kind of modify this. And what you have here is if you have your other project still open, up at the top you can hit load into project. So when I load that in, it's going to now be part of this, this particular project. And now when I go to view and sheet, I now have that option here to pick the one that I just modified. So I've got the in-class E1 30 by 42. And basically what happens when you create a sheet is in your project browser off to the right, it'll add under sheets. If you expand that, it's actually going to add a sheet there, and they're going to be numbered. So each, because this is kind of set up for construction documents, so you're going to have some kind of number and then a title. You don't really have to mess around with that unless you really want to, define what that page is. But normally this number and the title would be something that would show up on a title block because there are sheet number and sheet name parameters that are normally on the title block. Yes?
Question. When you went to load into project, what
Yes.
if you have multiple projects open? Can you choose which one?
Yeah, if you had multiple projects open, you'll get this extra dialog box. And actually, I can do that real quick here. So let's say I have this other architectural template open. So I've got 2 projects open in the background, or if you had 4 or 5, whatever. And I go back to this and say load into project, you'll get this other dialog box where now you can either check all of them, to load this in, or you could, switch to whichever one you want. So I'm going to go back to switch windows, and then I'm in, let's see, there we go. So once we have that and we've got our view set up, so anything that you actually want to be on a piece of paper is going to be a separate view that is in the project browser. So for instance, if this is your first floor plan and you wanted this to be your color fill legend, that would be this view. But let's say you wanted a first floor plan that showed something else that wasn't color fill and had some other information on it. You're going to want to right click on where it says level 1 and choose duplicate view. And you can just, there's a couple of duplicate options there. The first one is duplicate, and that's just going to basically make another copy of this view, and then you can make your modifications that you want. So I could actually turn off my color fill scheme on that particular one. So you'd have copy of level 1, and then you have level 1 that's still your other one. So for every drawing type that you have of the same part of your model, you're going to have to copy the views to make any kind of additions or subtractions that you want. So if you've got one that's going to be more of a, like I said, the color fill scheme, or if you got another one that's going to show more information about code, for instance, if you're doing like an egress plan or something like that, you would have a separate plan for that and then do all your drawings on top of that. Is there a question? Okay. So now we've got those different drawings, and we also have that section cut. That's part of there. So I'm going to go to A102, which happens to be that sheet that was blank. My A101 was the one that had the title block. You can also select that title block and change it, over here to the left. I could change it over to, just the regular piece of paper. But what you do is we just basically click on, let's say, the level 1 floor plan, and I'm going to hold in my left mouse button and then drag it onto the sheet, let go, and then click. Now, Revit, because again, this is always set up for potentially doing construction documents, it's always going to have this little tag here. We can get rid of that, or you could modify that. But what I would typically do, for right now, is you can click on this view, and if you're familiar with AutoCAD, this is basically a viewport into the model. And what this is this is the viewport, and you can see to the left when you click on it, it has some properties. It's called viewport 1, and we can click edit type, and it just has some additional information in there. So you could turn where it says show title, I could change that to no, and that little tag will go away. So if you want to, eventually put in your own text or something like that, but that tag, I'll Control Z that so you can see, but that tag is going to be the name of your project browser, whatever name's over there, or if you click on this view, the viewport, and you can't see it because we're missing part of our screen there, but here, I'll scroll. There we go. There's a section here called Title on Sheet, And I could actually call this, let's say, all in caps, first, floor plan, color scheme, whatever you want to call it, color scheme, and that would change your tag there for that. This tag's pretty small. One thing you could do if you really want to modify that, if it's really important to have on your drawings, under the families, and where it says annotation symbols, if we expand that, you should be able to find this option here called View Title. And again, this is going to be a family again. We can right-click on it and hit Edit, and then you're in this mode where I could actually select this text, and this text has its own properties. So Edit Type, right here, that text is set to 1/8 inch. If I really want to, I'd make it like 3/8 of an inch. Make it bigger. You can change the font, Arial Black or Bauhaus or whatever you want to put in there. So it's going to read whatever Windows fonts that you have on your computer or the computer that you're on, and I can, just click there and modify it. Kind of modified everything. Actually, I should have duplicated this. Edit, duplicate, and then just make the change to that top portion. So this way I have all that, and then you could load that into your project. I guess I'm in project 1, override it, and you've got that. Now it's bunched up like that. What we can do is make sure that when you're in this view, you just drag the rest of that boundary that's associated with your text. And we'll go over a little bit more on text in a little bit here. But that's basically the boundary of your text wrap. And I can load that in. So basically I've got that particular file there, or that particular view on that sheet. Now that drawing, when you print it at full scale, is going to be whatever the scale is. So if I go to level 1, down here at the lower left, whatever scale this view is at, so it's at 1/8 inch equals a foot, that's going to be your scale that it's actually going to print on. So if you really want this to be bigger or smaller, you would click on this and you could change whether this is 3/8 of an inch equals a foot, or whatever you want it to be. Yeah.
Does that work the other way around? Because I know you can click here and change the scale. Does that change the scale of the first floor drawing?
Yeah. So if you're actually in the sheet itself, instead of going back into it, so if I was in this sheet, I could click on that view, and you could also change here where you can see here it says 3/8 of an inch equals a foot. I can change it, and I'm only changing it for that viewport. And I could go ahead and find, let me go back to maybe 1/8 inch. You can also right-click on this viewport and choose Activate View, and that basically is kind of like activating, just like an AutoCAD, going into that piece of paper and going back into the view where you can actually manipulate the model or make any other additional changes that you want. When you're done, you can right-click and hit Deactivate View, and you come back into the paper. Now you can add as many of these drawings as you want to fill up the piece of paper. So I can go ahead and find my section number 1, and I'm going to drag that onto my sheet. And you'll notice one thing is when I start to hover over my drawing, my other viewport, watch what happens where this section occurs. It automatically tries to align exactly where that section occurs in the floor plan. So that's kind of nice if you're trying to get everything to really line up well on your piece of paper and you don't want to have to draw guidelines. Revit does try to snap to certain axes that would be familiar from one view to the other. That also works the same way if you were to, let's say, get an elevation view. I'm just going to pick the east and drag that on. Now watch what happens when I drag the elevation near the section. It's going to try to line up basically where my levels are, so that you'd have your floor plan sections all starting at the same location, or your elevations and sections all coming up from that one location. Now obviously if it doesn't fit on your paper, you have to do some adjustments, but it's basically just laying out a sheet in that manner, and you can have as many different drawings that you want. They could be different scales. So let's say you had your plan, your section, an elevation, and then you're going to have a blow up of a wall section. So actually, let's go into this section real quick. I'm going to take the left wall here, and I'm going to change it to the exterior brick on metal stud. I'm also going to change my view to a fine view, just so I can see, some of this detail in here. But if you wanted this to be a wall section, typically what I normally do is you have an overall section that shows, the overall building. And then a lot of times what you would see in construction documents is you'd go to view, and there's this another view type called a call out. And you can draw this kind of window, and it's kind of like this blow up detail that would go around whatever you're trying to eventually kind of blow up to another scale. So to go over that again, I went to view, call out, and then you can do that. And it'll make a box. You can also do a call out where you sketch. So if you wanted to do a circle call out or some other odd shape, you can use the sketch command, and that gives you tools, for instance, where it looks like I could do something like that. Not that I'd want to do that, but it doesn't look like you can do a circle, but you can do different polygons.
Is there a reason why my call-out would be grayed out?
Yeah, the rest of your sheet is probably grayed out because you're still activated in the view of your color fill scheme. So right now you've got it looking like this. Go ahead and right-click on the white space and just hit deactivate view. That'd bring you back into the sheet. And what I did is I'm actually on my project browser, I'm in section 1, and that's where I'm doing these call-outs and drawings. So this section was at 1/8 inch. Now when I double left-click in this bubble, that will take me into another scale. It usually tries to double whatever scale the original drawing was. But let's say this is going to be a wall section. I probably want to change that to 3/4 inch equals a foot and turn this on to fine view. And I'll keep it like that for now, but I'm going to also drag that onto this sheet. So I can go to A101, and right here it's called call out of section 1, and I can go ahead and put that on there as well. So again, you can have all these different views, and you'll notice that you can see kind of the view boundary of all of these. There's kind of a box around my section. There's also a box around this wall section. When I go back into the view, that is your crop boundary. So if you decided you wanted to, crop this or see more things, you can drag that. The other crop boundary that's dashed, that's around there, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically that is called an annotation crop. So when you start actually doing text notes and dimensions and things like that on your drawing, you could crop off certain text if you don't want to see it. The other thing is, let's say this wall section, I'm going to click that wall and make it like 40 feet tall. So let's say I've got this wall section, and the requirement is I need to really show this at 3/4 inch equals a foot in order to see the detail or the level of detail of this wall. But when that wall happens to be 40 feet tall, and I go back into my page, notice obviously that wall section is going off of the sheet of paper.
Oops.
Revit has this really nice option, which a lot of times people will do in CAD. When you've got a really tall wall section and a lot of it's the same in between, you would chop up that wall section a little bit and kind of bring it together. But the trouble of doing that, and you have the little break lines, the trouble of doing that, especially in CAD, is that once you do that, you lose the whole, if you ever had to measure what the height was of that wall section, you kind of just lost that, that measurement. So what you can do is, if we go back into this view, and I'll keep it, actually I'll activate it here so I can see the edge of the paper. If you click on that boundary, you see the little lightning bolts off to the side. When you click on those, it now brings it so I can drag this together, and you now cut that wall section down to whatever you want to see. And you can still measure, so if I were to click on a dimension and measure all the way to the top, it's still going to read 40 feet. And if you don't want that anymore, let's say you decide you really want to see this whole thing, if you keep dragging it until they touch again, then it goes back to its original shape. And you can cut that up as much as you want. You can see every time you cut, you have some more lightning bolts. So you can go ahead and cut that up and slice it up as much as you need in order to fit on a sheet of paper.
How'd you move it down at this point?
So yeah, and inside there's a little up-down arrow. It's kind of hard to see, but it's right there in the middle. You can just left-click on that and drag. Actually, hold in the left mouse button, and then you can drag it. So that's kind of a nice feature as well. The other thing is if you want to have the break lines that go in there, let's go ahead and click on Insert. I'm going to load a family, and under Annotations and Architectural, nope. Break line, where'd you go? Annotations. Oh, under Detail Items, then General, there's a break line. So if we load that up, and we can place that by going to Annotate, and you place it as a component under Annotation. I just want to show you this kind of deal. Basically, when you place that and hit the space bar to rotate, you can see how it starts to cut and hide some of the model, so you can actually get kind of true break lines that you would see. I'm going to mirror that. Just place it. So hit the space bar, it rotates. And then I don't want to see this boundary anymore. All that is down at the very bottom is a hide crop region. If you select that, that'll go away. So I'm going to deactivate that view. So anyway, that's kind of the basics of setting up a drawing. But once you have all of this on a piece of paper, what we can do now is then print it. So you're ready to print it, send it over to the print lab. The best way to print out of Revit is to print to Adobe PDF. That's why I'm glad they finally got that on these computers, is to print to Adobe PDF, and then from Adobe PDF you can send it to wherever you need it to be plotted. So that's really the best way. You'll generally get good line weights when you do that versus going straight to a plotter. So to print, you don't have to be in a sheet view, but if you are, you can go to this little Applications menu, and there's the part here where it says Print. You're going to hover over that, and then you can go to Print. You got a fatal error by going to that?
Oh, it just like straight up gave me a fatal error. I didn't even touch it.
So again, make sure you go into this Applications menu. I'm going to click on Print, and then up here choose the Print option, and you'll get this dialog box. Now there's something important here. Is first thing is we have to select the right printer. So you should be able to scroll down, and hopefully everyone should be able to find Adobe PDF. If you're using your own computers, you got to make sure that the Adobe PDF is also installed on your Windows side. Because I know a lot of you have the dual boot system, so make sure it's on your Windows side, otherwise Revit's not going to be able to read it. So go ahead and choose Adobe PDF. Does everyone have that on at least the computers that are in the lab? If not, raise your hand because I need to know that. All right, cool.
Did you say this computer doesn't have it?
I actually didn't try it because I knew that it had not.
Oh.
Okay, so I've got the Adobe PDF, and the other part is down to the far right, there's this button here called Setup. You're always going to want to go into that and make sure that you're printing on the right size paper. So by default, it's always going to be like some kind of letter or 11 by 17 or whatever. But if you click on the down arrow, you should be able to see different paper sizes, and everyone should be familiar with architectural sizes, but you've got your ARC A through E, I guess there's E1, E2, and 3. The 30 by 42 is an E1. If you ever need to know what those dimensions are, just Google architectural paper sizes, and typically you'll see what ARC D is, 24 by 36, ARC B is 11 by 17, and so on. But anyway, you can kind of check that out. But so you got the E1, and then the other part that you really have to pay attention to is right here, where it says Paper Placement and Zoom. By default, it's always set to center and fit the page. If you select those options, you will not be printing to scale, because it's going to print fit to zoom whatever the printer boundaries might be for that piece of paper. So obviously if you're going all the way out to 30 by 42, it's actually going to shrink it in a little bit, ½ inch on all the way around, and you don't want to do that. So what you want to do is click on offset from corner and say no margin, and then where it says zoom, keep that at 100%. That'll guarantee that when this prints at 100%, that will be the right scale of all those different drawings that you put onto that piece of paper, and you should be able to verify that when it prints out. The other options here, portrait or landscape, we know about that, vector or raster. Because this has a color fill legend or color scheme in there, it'll probably automatically switch to a raster formatting just to print, and it'll tell you that. Don't worry about anything else here. Now go ahead and hit OK. Now I can either just pick current window, or let's say you have 20 sheets in your drawings or in this model and you want to print all of them. You could go to select views and sheets, and if I hit select, this is your batch plot where I can now select sheet A101 and A102, and that's what's going to print. I'm not going to save the settings. And you can either combine all of those PDFs, so you see here at the top or kind of in the middle, you can combine all the multiple sheets into one single file. So if you just want one PDF that has all 20 sheets in it, or you could create separate files for each one. I'm going to keep it on the separate files for now. And then that's all you really have to do, and you should be able to hit OK. And then it's going to want to save your PDF somewhere, and then save it, and it should generate, and then it should pop up, and then there's your print. So that's basically now an Adobe PDF or Acrobat reader, and now you can send it to wherever you want, or you can insert it into your InDesign file or whatever else you need to do with that, with those drawings. So pretty easy, and when I cancel out of that, it's going to print the other one, and my other one's blank. So now we can do that with any view. So right now, I'm going to kind of move. Actually, I'll draw on my other piece of paper, my A102. If you had a 3D view, so if you go to View and 3D, so here's this model that we've been working on. This could also be a view that you drag and drop onto a piece of paper as well. So I can click on my blank paper, which is 102, and then I can take that 3D view and go ahead and drag that onto my sheet. Now 3D views work a little bit differently. When it's an axon, you can scale it, so it has a scale, so 1/4 inch or whatever you want to do. I'll go back to 1/8. And when we get into perspectives here in a minute, we'll go ahead and do a perspective. Let me drag that off to the side. One thing that you also need to know is that once you place a drawing onto a sheet, that one drawing can only be on that sheet. So you can't take level 1 color fill plan and try to drag it onto this sheet because it already exists on another one. So if you really want to have that same floor plan on multiple sheets for some reason, you would have to just duplicate it and make another view and drag and drop it. Revit does that for a reason, because in construction document world, every one of these drawings has a specific number and a location on the sheet, and you don't want to duplicate that. If I go back to level 1, I'm going to do a perspective view. And to make a perspective view under 3D view, we click on the camera, and then we just go ahead and point and click, and then you've got your perspective view. Perspective views don't have a scale, obviously, so one thing that we can do with that view is when we bring that onto a piece of paper, so 3D view and drag and drop, you notice how small it is. But if I click on it, I can size the crop of this particular perspective. When I click on that, this dialog box that says Scale Locked Proportions, you want to click on that, and then you can change basically how big you want this view to be. So I could, right now the overall width is 6 inches. Maybe I make this want to be more like 11 inches wide. Oops. 11 inches. and that will scale this view up, and still maybe that's too small. Maybe I'll do 20 inches. Oops. Size crop, scale lock proportions. The field of view will just change the actual boundary of the view, but if you want to scale the size of the whole entire image, it's scale lock proportions, and then I've got that. And hide the crop region. And I'm going to go up to level 2 here real quick, and I'm going to draw a, let's just draw a roof. I'm not going to get too fancy here, but I'm just going to draw a rectangle. And it'll hip everywhere, that's fine. Say yes. Let's get that a little bit higher. 10 feet. And I'm also just going to throw in, over on this face, I'm just going to throw in a window and a door real quick. I want to show you a new feature that's part of Revit 2014. That's actually pretty cool. So I'm going to click on door. I'll place a door over here. And I'm just going to do a couple windows. Whatever is default. Not going to worry about it too much. So one thing, and this next thing has actually been around for a while, and I think I've shown you before, but you can, in this view, while you're in the 3D view, I'm going to right-click on this and hit duplicate, and I'm going to turn on a section box. In this view, copy of 3D, I'm going to turn on the option here where it says section box, and it's going to create basically a big wireframe box around your model. You can click on that box and you get drag handles in every direction, but essentially what that's going to do is create a 3D section for you wherever you want this to be. So I can kind of move this around, and you can kind of get this this wireframe box there. And so again, if you go to that 3D view and you got section box, and you can cut it up in many different ways. Obviously, you can also go down and plan. So I can cut that so you can kind of see into it. So I don't know how many of you have had to do that in Rhino, where you have to actually save your file and slice it and then work on it forever. You're pretty much done once you've got this, and all you have to do is, in your visibility graphics, again, you can go to annotation categories, and you should be able to find section box once you've sort of cut this up, and uncheck that, and that wireframe will go away. I'm going to undo that and get my roof back. That's actually been around for a couple, I think since Revit either 2012 or 13. But this other option, and again we can drag this onto a sheet of paper if we wanted to. I'm going to click on that box, actually just uncheck the section box, and that'll take me back. So there's this other option down here off to the very far right called, it's basically called displaced views. This is actually going to highlight displacement sets. What we need to do is, let me see if I can find it. Where'd it go? View. So this other option here is we can actually, in this 3D model, so I'm in this view, I can click on, let's say, the roof or any part. I'm going to click on pieces one at a time. And there's this option under Modify right there in the middle where it says View, and it's called Displace Elements. If I click on that, it then gives me kind of the axis, kind of like in the massing environment where we've got the little handles. And I'm going to move this roof up. Okay, but when I go back into a real 3D view, I didn't move anything in the model. So you're probably catching on to what this is going to do. We can make exploded axonometrics. So I can take this door, I'll displace it. Let's go ahead and move that out. I'm going to take this wall, I'll displace it. and we can move it out. So
How do you select just the door?
if you just select, you might have to tab
Oh,
over.
tab, that's
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not going to do all the different parts and pieces, but you kind of get the idea. The thing about it is, though, in order to displace an element, it has to be a separate element by itself. So, for instance, when we were doing all of those massing components in the last workshop, and all of that was like in one family, that won't be able to be displaced unless you separated that family into separate families. Does that make sense? So you can see here I could pull this door out because it's a door component all by itself. But if I had multiple doors within a family for some reason, it would pull that whole thing, that whole element out together. So you'd have all the doors in that family. But the other part here is when you click on that, look up at the top, you can edit, reset, or you can click on the path and hover over the corners, and it draws your dotted lines for you. I'll do it on the wall here. So I'm going to click on this this element, and let's say I want to draw the lines back to where it came from. You just pick the path option, and then you hover over kind of the corners, and you now have the dashed line that goes with it. This is probably one of the neatest things they've done in 2014, so that you can do all these exploded axonometrics and do whatever you want to really, obviously explain your project a little bit more of, what's happening. So it's a nice feature, and once you've got that, again, you can, just like in anything, drag that onto your piece of paper, and of course I'd need to scale it better, but you kind of get your different views there. So those are kind of the basics of getting drawings done and out of Revit. What I want to introduce is how to do renderings and work with materials a little bit, and then we can kind of cover some of these other topics like structure and some of the other things that I want to catch on. Did everyone get a username and password signed into the account at Autodesk Education Community? Everyone has one of those? If you don't, this next couple steps are not going to work for you. One thing you want to make sure, and I sent a link. Were you able to send that link around? Okay, so you want to make sure that if you haven't signed up, you get an account, because as a student in the Autodesk Education software, in my Bing, we disconnected when we left the building. Hold on a second, that's going to be a problem.
That displacement tool, that's only one.
So it should be, the Autodesk.com education free software, and off to the right, somewhere on here, there was a sign up. It was there last night. Free software. Anyway,
I think what I did was hit the sign in, and then under that it says need an education account.
okay, that's strange. Last night there's a whole big thing right here that you could actually click on. So yeah, you can go to sign in, and if you haven't, you can need an education account, whatever. We don't have to sign into this, but what we can do is in Revit, look up at the very top where it says sign in at the top right. That's your link directly to the Autodesk 360, and so when I click on that, this sign in to Autodesk 360 is going to load up, and it's going to be whatever your username and password was that you signed up with. And once you enter that in, your name should appear, whatever your username is, should appear up here in the top right. That means we're now connected to this cloud environment that we can do some renderings and other things. All right, so to kind of go over just the basics of rendering, I'm going to first do it based on if you weren't connected to the cloud, how you would render within Revit, and tell you some pros and cons of that. And then when we render to the cloud, what an option is that we have, and then also what the pros and cons are to rendering to the cloud. Obviously, we just have a very basic model here, but we all downloaded that zip file. Let's go ahead and I'm going to do a save as of this. let's call it. I'm going to close out of this file and all these other files I have open. And go ahead and open the file that I had you download. So it should have been part of that zip file. I'm going to go to close out of this. It should be open. And it should be a file called Render Pavilion. Let's do the Render Pavilion. There's two in there. There's one called Render Pavilion Site Model and then Render Pavilion. It's nothing fancy, but it's basically a piece of land and a little box house there. But what I want to do is go ahead and go back into like a floor plan view of this, and I'm going to click on level 1, and we're going to set up a 3D view of this. And in order to render, you have to have a camera view. So you can actually render, like an axon and things like that, but it's not going to give you the clouds that get generated and the sky that gets generated by Revit until you have a camera. And so pretty much most of the renderings that you want to do is always going to be involving some kind of perspective view. So I'm going to click on View, 3D View, and then again Camera, and I'll go ahead and just take some kind of view of this model. Now we can turn on in this view, just if you want to see how your materials might look before you render it. If you turn it on Realistic, it should at least give you, and it's hard to see up there, it's pretty dark, but there's really no materials placed in this model yet, but everything's kind of gray, and then my ground looks like dirt. So, so basically this part is just showing you what you have as far as materials involved in this. Right now I'm not going to worry about that, I just want to be able to set up the rendering. But in order to render an exterior view, I've got to have some kind of lighting. And so typically when you're on the exterior, you're going to want the sun. And what I'm going to do is go into like a site plan view, and I'm going to set up the sun angle and then the location of where this might be modeled and so on. So in order to do that, I'm going to turn on in the site model, I'm going to turn on, right now it's set to wireframe, I'm going to change it to a hidden line mode. And once you're out of wireframe, you have this option down here to turn on the sun path. So if I click on sun path and turn it on, it's going to pop up a little message here saying where do you want to continue with the current settings or use a specific project location. I'm going to click the first one. And that first one is going to be something that we can actually set in a little bit here. But basically what this is your sun path diagram. It's showing you where north is. North is always going to be straight up. But if your model is oriented in a different way and you know that north is supposed to be, let's say, 45 degrees in this location, or I'm going to actually say my north is to the right. So in order to change that, in your site model, you should be able to see this blue target. And if you don't see that in any other view, again, you can go to Visibility Graphics, VG, and that's found under the site, and it's called Project Base Point and Survey Point. If you turn those on, that will show you this little blue dot. Now, if I click on that blue dot, it gives me information here, and one of them down there is called Angle to True North. So 0 degrees is straight up. I think if I go -90, that will rotate my north to the right. Now, the bug here is that I just changed that true north location to -90, but my sun path diagram did not update. You see how it's still pointing north? The bug is you need to turn this off and turn it back on again, and it updates. So unfortunately, that is a bug that's been around for quite some time, but if you don't pay attention, you could update your true north and your sun path diagram would never update.
You turned what off from that one?
I just went down to the sun and I turned off the path and then I turned it back on. It's kind of like toggling. So anyway, now my north is over there to the right, and kind of the reason I did that is my view is over here and I want to be able to get sun on that face of the building. But the other part of this is when I go back to the sun icon and click on sun settings, This is where we can actually pick a particular location in the world based on Google Maps or some other mapping service. So where it says location, if you click on this button, and again, you have to be hooked up to the internet, but it's going to pick by default kind of Google Maps, and you can type in any address you want. So let's just say, I'll just say Charlotte, North Carolina, and that will set this location to Charlotte, North Carolina.
Where's the location button?
Hit cancel. Go back to sun settings up at the top there, and that's hold on a second. Does everyone have a dialog box that looks like this, or is it different? Okay, why is that one different? That's the teaching computer. Hold on. When you make your sun path diagram, if I turn this off and turn it back on, actually I don't get it. But remember that dialog box that popped up where we selected that first option? You want to select that first option, and that makes it so that in this view you have this dialog box that has the location setting. And I'm going to go ahead and let's pick Charlotte. Now, one thing I'm going to say real quick, and I say this all the time when I teach the rendering portion, is that the location of where your project really exists doesn't have to be truly the location where you render. Okay? One thing I stress is obviously you want that if you're trying to do like a true solar analysis and get sun and shading, but the goal of a rendering is to get a really nice looking image. So the sun in North Carolina on whatever date may not be the right sun, whereas you might try to find one in Africa or some other country that has, because the sun color is actually going to be slightly different from place to place. So actually Rhino, and if you use V-Ray, the default location for Rhino V-Ray, I forget which part in Africa, but it's some part in the desert, which happens to have like this really nice color of sun. And I always use that setting, and you get this really nice image every time. But anyway, just a side note, don't always be so specific to this location, but obviously you might want to be for other reasons. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK out of that, and that's also true, and I'll back up one more second, and that's also true for your true north. A lot of times, you might be trying to get a rendering of your back of your building, but if that's on the north side of your building, you may not get any kind of really nice, any kind of shadow line or something. Obviously, you got to be true to what you're trying to present in some regard, but you might want to kind of tilt it over a little bit so you can get the sun at least coming across some of it so that you can properly light it. So just some kind of tricks there. As you render more and more, you might have to tweak things just to get the lighting right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we changed the north setting in our project base point. Does that update the elevation? Like they're called east, north, southwest.
That will not. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Let me double check here.
I assume that the elevation marker wherever it was stays the same, and that the
the elevation. These are basic generic
preset
names. Yeah, they're preset. So they're north based on up.
Because I can see myself changing it.
And then
And then these will all not be correct in the labels or whatever.
Right. So what you'd probably want to do is right-click on them and rename them if you get into that. But that is true. Those aren't going to be that smart, smartly connected. That would be a good feature, though. So I'm going to go back to my site model where I was. And another thing is when you're on the SunPath settings, you have the option here to do like a still. So that would be a specific time and day. You could also do a whole single day, which that would eventually run into where do like a solar analysis. You could do multi-day and whatever. For right now, I'm going to keep it on still, and you can change the date and time right here in this dialog box. So, but it also shows you the sun, right here, kind of down at the bottom. I like to actually play with the sun path diagram instead. I'm going to turn this on a shaded view so we can see it a little bit better. you can scroll down or zoom down at the beginning, and you could change the date. So you could change the date. Instead of being June, I could change this to, something like March, get a lower sun. And then I can click on the sun, and you should be able to drag it by holding down the mouse button, and I can drag it anywhere along that path to pick another time, or you could specifically, type in a time if you really want to. So that's kind of nice. You can quickly, get a good, if I want the sun kind of behind there or coming in from another angle, I can pick that. So now we have the sun, we've got that set, but now whatever we do with the sun path diagram is only going to be effective in this view. So what that means is if you found a particular sun setting and you want to use this on multiple renderings, so you're going to have different views around the building, but you always want the sun at 3 o'clock or whatever I happen to have it on, we want to make sure that before we go into another view, I'm going to go to sun settings, and right here I'm going to click down at the bottom, save settings. And I can give this a name. I'll just call it test for now, whatever. That will add it to this little list that's over to the left, meaning that we'll be able to check, actually select that later on. So if you happen to have different sun settings that you want to use in other views, you just go ahead and set it up in one, like for instance, the site plan, and then keep saving the views, and it'll keep adding it to this location. The other part here is the sun is going to cast shadows from objects if based on default right here set to ground plane at level 1. They set that way because typically a lot of people don't throw in topography into their models or context, but you still want to render. And Revit will give you kind of a basic gray ground, which isn't that nice. But if you want shadows to actually be on the ground level, then you can pick, if it's level 1, level 2, or 3 based on your datums. Or if you had like another foundation level or wherever you wanted the shadows to get cast to. I typically turn that off, especially when you have topography, because you want the shadows to actually hit the topography and go down the hill or up the hill, depending on the grading of your site. So if you do that, then that shadow is going to go forever until it hits a plane somewhere down below. Does that make sense? So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then I'm going to go back into my 3D view. And while I'm in this view, this view 1 that we created, I have to now go back into my sun settings. And you'll see here that I don't have that option until I click still. And that's where I saved my test. So then go ahead and click OK. Now to render, it's pretty simple. Under View, you've got these little teapots up here. You got the render, and then you have render in cloud. So these are your two render options. I'm going to do the first one off to the left here, just called render. When you pick that, it'll give you a dialog box. It's a pretty simple dialog box, but what it's going to do is it gives you the chance to change your settings. So I could do draft, low, medium, high. For right now, since we're not really doing much, I'm just going to keep it on low. And then you can actually make it an output settings. You could do screen. That's going to be whatever size this image is on your screen. Or you could change it to printer. And you'll notice here, printer, it gives you a width and a height. And it says 6 inches by 4.5 inches, for instance, in this particular view. Now, if you want to change those are directly tied to your crop boundary that we just did in an earlier exercise. So what I'm going to do is just close out of this box real quick. And if you click the frame of this view, you get this option here to size the crop. That's that dialog box again, where I can scale the lock proportions. And therefore, let's say I want this rendering, I'm going to eventually print it, and I want it to be a pretty large rendering. So I want it to be like 24 inches by 36 inches. I'm not going to go that big here for the example. But let's say I'm going to print this on 11 by 17. You want this rendered image to be that size. So I'm going to type this at least 17 inches for the width, because it's scaled lock proportions. It's going to show you, whatever the height is based on that boundary. Now when I go back to View and click Render, my printer settings will now show 11 by 17, and then I can also change the DPI, so I can go 75 or to 600 or whatever. I think everyone knows by now that 150 DPI is the minimum to render at, and if you want to get a good printed image. Typically, there's not a whole lot of reason to go higher than that, unless you're trying to do like magazine print and other, other real high-res, solutions. Usually the 150 DPI, and if you've got your view set to exactly what you're going to print at, you're good to go. You don't need to really mess with that too much more. Your other options is your lighting. You can do exterior sun, or you could do artificial only, and then there's the interior side, and vice versa. So I'm just going to keep it on exterior sun only. I'm also going to I'm going to make it very cloudy. So my sky is going to be very cloudy, and I'm going to turn up the haze a little bit. And then I'm just going to hit render. Now what Revit's going to do is going to black out your screen for a second, or actually it could take a little bit longer than that. This is one feature I do not like since Revit 2013, is they changed the rendering way that this happens. It shows you this black screen for 50% of the rendering, and then all of a sudden it starts revealing the rendering, which is horrible, because if you're doing a really big rendering, it takes a while sometimes to get to 50%, and then you realize your material is wrong, or the lighting's wrong, or something's not looking right. Whereas before it used to do like it'd actually do like a pixelated view, kind of like in V-Ray or other maybe Maxwell render. It'll start to pixelate, but at least you could tell if the lighting was off, or if something wasn't looking right before it would finalize the pixelation. So just something. Hopefully they switch that back eventually. But eventually this is going to kind of render out this image. There's not a whole lot to it, but in the background it should be generating somewhat of a sky, and I'm not getting a whole lot of clouds here, even though I said very cloudy. Well, it is. I guess it is pretty cloudy. It's just not a great looking sky. Sometimes it might have to do with the draft that you're on, because here's a rendering that has a better looking sky. It's kind of hard to see up there, but it's got better cloud definition and so on. Anyway, Revit's going to generate a sky for you for each rendering, but you don't have to like that sky. You could actually get rid of that a little bit later. Two things that you have to do, or at least one thing you have to do once this rendering is complete. You either save the rendering to the project, or you export the image. So saving to the project, when I click on that, it's going to create another view in my project browser that's basically a copy of this image. The other part is to export it. Obviously, if you want to use this in InDesign or somewhere else, or you want to take it into Photoshop to add more things to it or whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and export the image. Now I'm going to show you a couple things here. If I go to export image, I have only a few options, but it's a JPEG, a PNG, or a TIFF. Obviously, don't ever do a bitmap. We all know our images, but they do different things when we export. So I'm going to actually export all three of these. I'm going to do a JPEG first. I'm going to keep whatever the view name is. So I'll hit save. Then I'm going to do the PNG file, and then I'll do it as a TIFF. Now, when I close this rendering box, my rendering goes away, and then I'm back to the model. That's why it's important to save those images once it's done, especially if this rendering took like an hour to do, or whatever the time frame might be. And it's all going to be dependent on how complex your model is and the materials that you're using and so on. You can get the rendering back by going back to your render dialog box, and before you hit render again, there's this option here to show the rendering, and it will show it again. But I haven't really tested that to see how long that remembers the rendering. I assume once you hit the render button again, it's not going to show you this again, but I could be wrong. Anyway, it's good to make sure you always save that rendering. Now this rendering that I saved here in the project browser, and I don't have any sheets set up here, but again, I can drag that onto a sheet and print that onto PDF as well. So that's the same thing, you basically, it'll be whatever was straight out of Revit, and you won't have the opportunity to do any kind of Photoshop work or whatever. But if you had an image from elsewhere, let's say you took this out and then did some Photoshop work, you could also hit insert and then load in an image. So I actually could find, one of these images, the 3D view again, and I could place it, on a piece of paper too. So if you wanted to take it out, do some, Photoshop work and then bring it back in, that would be one method of doing that.
Did you just insert it right into the page?
Yeah, I just hit insert and then image, and then I just placed it right on the page. So the one thing I wanted to show you, though, is let's say I go into Photoshop, and let me load that up. So Revit has generated this sky, and it's always going to generate a sky for you if you're doing an exterior rendering. But when I drag and drop, let me take all of these 3D views and show you the difference. The JPEG has the sky and has everything in there that was part of that rendering. The PNG file takes out the sky and leaves you a transparent background even through the windows. You see that? You don't have to do all that cutting, all that stuff you have to do in Photoshop where you trace and cut. It's crazy. This will quickly give you, where you can actually see you can still see the glass. Of course, my glass material is pretty clear, but if you had like a frosting on the glass or whatever, you would still see the frosting, and then whatever you put behind it, you would kind of see some of that going through there. So that's kind of cool too, depending on what you do with the different materials. The TIFF file does the same thing, so the TIFF and the PNG are kind of exactly the same. So obviously the TIFF files are probably preferable, when you start working in Photoshop and adding more to it and so on. So those are your image options. So again, obviously if you don't like the Revit sky, you can go ahead and insert your own, but make sure you save that as a TIFF or a PNG to get that transparency. So I'll close out of that. Now, before we get into adding materials and so on, let's go ahead and click on that 3D view and let's render to the cloud. There's a couple things that we have to do before we render to the cloud. One is you need to make sure you're signed in up here at the top. The other thing is part of this 3D view, there's this button over here under camera that has render settings. We have to set these prior to loading it into essentially the data farm that we're going to be sending it to. This is again your quality and your lighting and your clouds and so on that were part of that initial render dialog box. So I'm going to actually change this to high. I'll do exterior sun only. I've got my sun setting set to test. And let's make this very cloudy. I'll keep all those things. And then I'll click OK. That basically sets everything just like we just did, but it's actually setting it for this view as a default. Now I can go to View and hit Render in Cloud. And it's going to give you some instructions. I'm going to walk you through that, so I'm going to hit Continue. And rendering in the cloud will give you this dialog box. It should say Autodesk 360. And there's a couple things that you need to be aware of. Down at the bottom, it's going to talk about cloud credits. You do not need to worry about these. Cloud credits actually cost money. So if you are a firm, a professional firm, and I still don't know what the equivalent of a cloud credit is to dollars, but somehow they bill you for it based on whatever you do. But you'll notice to the right there it says unlimited with an asterisk and it has education community. As long as you have an education account and you signed in at that website that I sent around and you're signed in there, you have unlimited access to the cloud rendering, which means you can use all the features such as, and I'll talk about them here in a minute, under output type where it says still image, if you click on that, you can do an interactive panorama, and you can also do an illuminance study, which we won't get into. But the Autodesk 360 also has other cloud services that are available on their website. That is energy analysis and all these other like structural analysis, which you guys probably won't get into. But it has all these other features that you have unlimited access to. So you might want to check out the Autodesk 360 website and see all the things that you can do. But for us, straight out of Revit, it's going to be primarily used for rendering.
What if it has a number there instead of a list.
It should still say, even if you have a number, 3, 4. So you did not sign into the right spot for some reason.
Oh,
A couple students in my BIM class had that same issue. I'll email the instructions that I got from Autodesk. There were 2 students that they said they signed in on the education website, and for some reason it was trying to, bill them or say that it would cost money.
yeah.
As long as you didn't enter in any bank information, you should be fine. But it might limit you then only to it said up to 4 cloud credits were free. So you're gonna want to get that fixed, and I'll send out that information. So if it doesn't say education community, you might want to check out that email that I'll send out. But anyway, for now, what we can do is, since you have unlimited access, what I would do is make sure you get the best quality print and image out of this cloud rendering, because you don't have to pay for it and you can experiment all you want. So I'm going to keep it on still image. One thing that's nice about this is, let's say I had other 3D views. So where it says 3D view, I could actually do a batch render. So let's say I had 8 views of my building. I could go ahead and hit checkbox on all of those, and they're going to send all of those renderings to the cloud to get rendered at the same time. I guess one thing I forgot to mention is, when we render here just straight in the computer, so if I go back to that basic rendering we just did, when you render using just the computer, once you hit the render button, you can't do anything in your Revit model anymore until your rendering is done. So you can imagine if you had 8 renderings to do, and they all maybe take an hour to render, or whatever the time frame might be, you're going to have to spend 8 hours in front of your computer and or copy your model onto 8 different computers and have 8 computers rendering. But essentially what's going to happen is you're done working on that model and you can't do anything else to it until that rendering's done. That is the disadvantage of working straight on your computer. Plus, it's going to be all based on your speed is going to be based on whatever hardware you have on your computer. The nice part about rendering to the cloud is you can render as many images as you want at the same time. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to do still image. I'm going to change my render quality to final. And where it says image size, it's going to be based on megapixels, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you might as well go to 16 megapixels, to get the biggest high quality rendering that you can get, so you can print it and use it for high quality, posters or wherever you're going to be doing. For this example, I'm just going to do, I'll just do large for now. But you can see as I click on these, it starts adding up cloud credits. So if I were to actually go to maximum, it's saying that this is going to be a 16 cloud credit rendering, whatever that might be. The other part is you've gotten an exposure. It's set to advanced by default. I always change this to native, and the difference is advanced is the Revit server or the farm that's up in a data center somewhere is going to apply some kind of lighting scheme to your model. So anything that you set up, like the sun that we just did and the clouds, and if you were doing an interior rendering and you set up all your lights, it's going to negate all that and it's going to do its own thing. So I always change it to native, because that's going to actually pull all the information that you've already set up in your model up there. I'm not quite sure why. I haven't used the advanced feature that much, so I don't really know all the benefits, but it seems like it always messes up your renderings because it's not what you expect when you send it up there. And the other part here is you got your file format. It's going to be your PNG, JPEG, or TIFF. And then it has your alpha transparency background. That is basically what just happened when we did the rendering inside of Revit, and I saved it as a PNG file, and it made your background transparent, the sky. If you click on that box, it's going to make all your renderings, transparent and not have the sky. So the one thing with the cloud is if you want their sky, you have to uncheck that box, and it doesn't matter if it's going to be a PNG, a JPEG, or a TIFF, unless that box is checked or unchecked, or that's going to toggle that feature. So that's a slight difference between rendering inside and rendering out into the cloud. I'm going to keep that as a sky because I want whatever's going to be produced. And then at the very end here, you can click on email me when the rendering's done. It'll just end up in your inbox or your junk email probably, but it'll send you a rendering notification saying it's done in the in the cloud. The other part here is it says estimated wait time is 1 hour. That's a lie. It's always there just to probably cover them. Essentially, when I hit start rendering, it's going to start sending this information to the cloud, and then it's going to start rendering up there. And chances are you'll get your rendering in about 5 minutes or 10 minutes or less than that. What's nice about that is, number one, if you're using your own computer, and I've had renderings that take like 24 hours before the cloud came out, especially when you get into interior renderings where you've got photorealistic lighting and so on, and a lot of materials that are metal and all that good stuff. You could have a really long rendering, and I'm sure you guys have experienced that. Send it to the cloud, and you could probably have 8 renderings done in about an hour or less. So that's kind of nice. It's a nice feature, but there's going to be some pitfalls to it, and I'm going to show you an example here. But once it's done, this is rendering in the cloud. You can see the little wheel spinning next to your name. If the wheel is not spinning anymore, then it's done up there in the cloud. But basically, I can keep on working in my model. So I could send a rendering, and I can keep moving and maybe work on setting up another view, and then send that. I don't have to sit there and wait for it to be done. You'll also notice when I did the render to the cloud, that dialog box popped up, and it said continue working in the background. If you click on that, you don't have to watch that dialog box spin. So to view where your rendering is, if you go to render gallery, that's going to load up basically the page up there in the cloud, and it's going to show you your rendering, basically all your files you've ever sent up there, and it's going to start, looks like I got this one right there. And saying estimated wait time is 1 hour, so not sure when that's going to really come through. But the point is, now this rendering lives up there in the cloud, and then eventually you'll be able to download it from here. Now I've got a couple notes for you. When you render to the cloud, you can see here this is called Render Pavilion. That's the name of whatever your file is going to be up here in the cloud. You'll see that I have other renderings as part of this. This is probably from last semester. There you go. Here's my rendering starting. These are from last semester or whatever, but if you have the same name of a model, it's going to keep adding to that section. So obviously it's kind of like a folder up there. The other thing to keep in mind is, let's say you render your 3D view and you want to look at it in different lighting. So you got one that's going to be a morning sun and another one's going to be afternoon sun. If they are named the same exact view, every time you send it to the cloud, it's going to overwrite the previous image file. So keep that in mind, that if I were to go back and do some tweaks, but I wanted both images, I probably want to duplicate that view, give it a new name in Revit before I send it to the cloud. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it's going to keep making it this particular image. So I'm not sure, it really shouldn't take this long to render that view, but again, it's all dependent on where you are in line. But the nice thing again is you're done with that option. Now I'm going to tell you the downside. So the plus is the timing. Okay, you can render a lot of different images quickly, and you can continue working, and you can pretty much work up until close to the deadline, and not have to worry about your rendering taking 24 hours and not getting it done in time for your presentation. I've got this example rendering. This is rendered directly on my computer. What you're going to notice here, what I want you to see, is look at the water. See how it looks pretty choppy and wavy, and I've got a nice reflection. The boat looks kind of bright and vibrant. Then I've got all my entourage, all the trees, and you can see the shadows look actually pretty nice with all the trees. Actually looks pretty realistic from whatever the sun angle might have been on this. That's straight from the computer. You're going to get a slightly different rendering. This is the same exact rendering in the cloud. My water's flat. I don't have the waves. My boat is real dark. And look at the shadows for the trees. They're not quite realistic. They're these weird kind of arrowheads or whatever down there. And then sometimes, not these trees, but I've seen some of my students in the BIM class, whatever tree they pick happens to turn out really bright fluorescent for some reason. So what I'm going to tell you is exterior renderings usually don't take very long on your own computer to render, unless you've got a lot of reflective materials and so on. I would suggest rendering exterior renderings on your computer because you get the big difference here and the nicer graphic. Obviously, if you're running into time, you'd send it to the cloud. But when you get into interior renderings, which we're going to do here in a minute with our other test box, is that interior renderings pretty much look identical from this computer and then to the cloud. The difference is, we all know interior renderings take so much more longer to produce, and so therefore you really want to use the cloud as much as you can, especially while it's free, to do those interior renderings. So just a kind of something to note while you're looking at these two images. Quite a difference. And they're the same materials. I didn't change anything. All I did was hit render to the cloud or render to the computer. I even tried to tweak the material, and then when I send it back, it still made it look like this. So just some things to note. And I believe they're, every time they make an update to the Autodesk 360, it's getting better, but there are still some limitations. So here again, here's my image as it's being rendered. It's not fully done. But one thing that's nice about the cloud as well is that before it gets to 50% in the progress bar, it's actually showing you some of the image. It's kind of like Maxwell rendering, where when it first starts out, it's pretty pixelated, and as it goes further and further, it starts to get more and more refined. So you can immediately start to see if you've set up your drawing or your view correctly, and you got your sun right, and the materials are looking okay, and you don't have to wait for it to complete if you need to make a tweak. When this is done, and I'm not going to use this one because it's still rendering, let's say I go to my other image. When it's done, in order to get that image back so you can use it, it's just like a website. You right-click on this image, and then you can choose Download Image, and then it's going to download it to whatever file format that you had chosen, either the PNG, TIFF file, or JPEG. All right? So that's the basics of just getting a rendering. But what I want to do now is get into a little bit more detail about how to use materials, and then also how to do an interior rendering, because interior renderings are all based on lighting, and there's a different theory in Revit versus what you would typically do in Rhino and other programs when it comes to lighting a model. So I guess I'll keep that open. I guess I closed it. Never mind. Go back to my render gallery just so it's available. There should be another file. I'm going to close out of this. Oh, and one thing, you see, I guess it's still rendering up there, but you know that first dialog box that popped up that showed you it was sending the data? Don't close Revit until that box goes away. So if you're like at the end of your studio day and you send a bunch of renderings, you want to make sure that that dialog box goes away before you shut down. Otherwise, you've chopped, you stopped all the data from being transferred. So that that happens sometimes too. But what I want to do is go ahead and let's open up another project. In that same zip file, there should be one in here called Interior Render Test Box. I'm actually going to call this, and this is an old file, so it's going to upgrade for a second. There shouldn't be a whole lot to upgrade. I'm going to call this more the interrogation room because it's really a box with a chair in it in the corner, and we're going to take some shots of that and try to get it properly lit. So if you go and look at level 1, it's basically a basic box. I've got a chair, and we're going to look at that chair and kind of test out a few things. So interior rendering is a little bit more of an art form in that it's all about getting your lighting levels correct and your materials, and then also making sure that you've applied materials to everything. One thing is, right now everything's a default gray, because we haven't done anything with materials yet. But what you want to make sure you do is, when you're rendering a shot or an image, it's good to make sure you have materials everywhere in that image so that it actually looks realistic when you model it or when you render it. So what I'm going to do is let's set up a view here, again, by going to View, or 3D View, and Camera. And I'm going to point and click from this other opposite corner, and I'm going to look towards this chair. So we kind of get our little corner there that we're going to be looking at. This box has a floor, has some walls, and also has a ceiling. I went over how to put in a ceiling in the first one, right? You guys know how to do ceilings? Kind of. It's basically, if you're in a ceiling plan, I'm going to, actually I'm going to change this out a couple times. Let's delete this. I'm going to tab over till I can select the ceiling and delete it. If you go to architecture and ceiling, again, you can place it by like automatic sketch, or you can do a sketch ceiling. I should be able to hover over with automatic sketch and just place, whatever grid in there. That's basically it. You point and click as long as you have a enclosed space. If you don't, then you'd sketch the ceiling. And we went over in a previous class or workshops, how to tilt that ceiling up if you wanted to, and so on. So 3D view, I guess we made a new view. So view 2 is our new deal. So this is the view we want. I'm going to turn on my shaded view just to kind of look at everything. And again, there's really nothing going on in there. It's all gray. And I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and render this. So I'm going to click on view and click on render. And we'll keep it as a draft. But in order to do an interior rendering, we have to change where it says scheme for lighting scheme. I need to change that to be an interior scheme. Now I'm going to do interior artificial only, and then I'll hit render. Now I'm doing this on purpose. Obviously what's going to happen here is we're going to end up with a big black screen because we have no lights placed within this model. So Revit doesn't know how to light this scene. Therefore, if there's no light, it's just going to end up black. So when I close out of that, I need to add in some lights and then start to render this again, and then we'll start working with materials. Lighting in Revit works exactly the same way as in real life. I won't say exactly, it's close. Look up in the ceiling right now. Look at how many lights there are to light this room. Of course, these are old lights, but we've got, what have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 2x2 lights, and then we've got perimeter lighting. Of course, we have a window. There's all this light in here just to light this room, but look how many lights there are. That's how many lights you're going to have to place in order to get a realistic rendering, because Revit's going to actually read light data, and you can actually get real lights from manufacturers that are BIM lights or Revit lights that have true photometric lighting as part of that light. So when you bring in their light, you actually know how bright it's going to be within your space. So that's really nice. You can, put in some lights, look at a space. If it doesn't look bright enough or it's too dim, you need to put in some more lighting somewhere and keep on working. So it's kind of a nice tool. I've got some basic lights that are already loaded into this project, and we're going to use those. But in order to place lights, a couple lights are going to be, and lighting will come in different, there's different ways that it's going to come. You can have a light that is ceiling hosted. You can have a light that's face based. You can have a light that's wall based. You can have a light that's ground based or floor based, and then you can have a light that's just free floating. But it all depends on who modeled that light, where it came from, and what template they used when they set that up. So the problem with that is if you got a really cool light and they did it ceiling hosted, and you want to use it, and you don't have a ceiling in your project, you're not going to be able to use it. So we'll try to, I think I have some lighting examples in here that will be in that way. So first thing I'm going to do is just let's place a light and then render it and talk about lighting in general. I'm going to go back to architecture and component, and all lights are going to be a component, just like a family. You can see here I've got in the drop-down menu here a series of different lights. And I'm going to pick the one here. Let's just pick the one called 2x2. It should be a lighting at the very top, ceiling light linear box. Let's go ahead and do the 2x4. I'm going to pick that. And then you can see that when I try to place it anywhere outside of the ceiling, I get the little no symbol saying that I can't place it. But as soon as I hover over the ceiling, I'm able to put that in. I can then rotate it. We've got a little 2x4 grid there, so I'm going to rotate this so it fits in the grid. And if I align it to the grid line, I don't have to lock it, but I could change this grid I could actually move the grid by selecting the grid, and I'll move it over, let's say 2 feet, and the light will move with it. So you can move these kind of hatch lines and place this exactly where you want it, if that's where you wanted this light to end up. So again, I'm just hitting move. I could also rotate that grid, so maybe this is going to be a 45 degree. So you can do all those type of things, and that light's going to move wherever that grid is. There's some kind of connectivity to that. So I placed one light, and now I can go back to my 3D view. I can see that it popped in there, and now I can go back to view and then render. And I'll do a low and artificial light and just hit render. This time when I render, I should get a little more of a room here. You can see why I'm calling it the interrogation room. I've got the little light now above the chair. It looks really, really dark up there, but on your computer it should look a little bit nicer. You should see kind of an orange chair, and then everything else is kind of kind of a chipboard color. It's really dark up there. So anyway, you should see it on your computers a lot better, and also on the video. So obviously we placed that one light. That happens to be the light level of this particular light that I had. So obviously if I want this room to really be lit up, I need to do exactly what I just talked about, is go back to level 1, ceiling. And I need to be in a ceiling plan to see this. And I'm going to let's copy this light over and over again, and I'll select all 4 and then copy some more. So next time you're kind of walking down a hallway or in another room, take a look up and see how many lights there are in a room. And that's generally what you're going to need to produce when you're trying to make your interior rendering. So one thing is, keep in mind that before you just get a nice interior shot, you need to spend a little bit of time thinking about the lighting design and throwing in lights, because that's what's going to show up. Now in V-Ray, and I can go ahead and hit render here in this one. V-Ray and Rhino and 3D Studio Max, people always tell you about the 3-point lighting method. I don't know if anyone's still teaching that, but that's a kind of another theory for rendering, is that you kind of do a big overall light somewhere, and of course in other programs the light doesn't necessarily render. So you do a big overall light, then you do like an accent light on something that you're trying to highlight, for instance like the chair, and then you would kind of put another light somewhere where it's dim, and that's your 3-point lighting scheme, and that usually lights a room pretty well. The problem with that is it doesn't light it realistically, but it gets you a quick rendering because it's only 3 lights that it has to render. Just keep in mind, obviously the more lights you place, the longer your rendering might be, but we don't have to worry about that because we're rendering to the cloud. So I've got that image there, and I did all of that. Now let's go ahead and render that to the cloud. You can see how now I can actually see, also up there on the board I can see it a lot better because I've lit that room pretty well. I'm going to do the same thing. Let's go ahead and hit render in cloud. But before I do that, remember we have to go to render settings and make sure we set that so our quality set to high or best. I got my interior artificial only. And one thing that you'll notice is that you have this additional button here that allows you to click on the artificial lights. When you click on that, that's going to show you every light that's in the model. Now the reason that's there is, let's say you had a very big project of 300,000 square feet or however big your building is, and you've placed lights everywhere in that project. One thing to keep in mind, and you probably know this from other rendering experience, is that when you render this camera view, even though I'm in this room, it's still rendering all the other spots of your model somewhere off into space, even though you don't see that. So what that's going to do is add more and more time to your rendering. Therefore, what you want to do is probably turn off all the lights that don't pertain to this room. The way that you know what light to turn on and off is when I click on that light, notice you have a number. It says this light is number 39, for instance. Every light you place gets its own unique number. When I go back to my render settings and click on artificial lights, here's my number 39 light. I can uncheck it. Now, what you can do, that sounds like you're going to have to go around and write down all these numbers to figure out what light you want to turn on and off. What I could do is go into a ceiling plan, and let's say I select all of these lights. When I've got all of the lights selected in the options bar, I can assign this to a lighting group. So I can click on this and click Edit New, and I'm going to choose a new group, and let's call this Interrogation Room. Interrogation. I don't know if I'm spelling that right, but anyway, I've got that set because that happens to be the lights that pertain to this room. Now, when I go into my render dialog box, or that the render setup, so I have to go back to that view, and I click on Render Settings and Artificial Lights, I now have my interrogation room. Actually didn't group those lights. So I need to take all of these lights and select Move to Group. I don't know why that didn't happen. And I moved all those lights into that group. So now what that allows me to do is I can turn on this group on and off. And so I could only select the lights that pertain to, whatever views I'm actually going to see. So that's kind of a good method to help speed up your renderings as well. And then need to change that back to high. And then I'm going to render that in the cloud. We're going to do some comparisons in the cloud back and forth here on both sides when we start adding materials in this next step. I'm going to go back to Final. I want to do native lighting. I'll keep it at megapixels. Background doesn't matter, and I'll hit Start. Now, one thing I didn't mention is Revit in the cloud is measuring everything by megapixels instead of knowing what the size of your sheet is. And I don't really know, it's hard for me to remember how big a megapixel is going to be on a piece of paper. So what I've done is in my class website, and I'll send you a link to this too, I'll try to remember that. Under the jrodesign.com/Revit, under public access, I have frequently asked questions. If you scroll down, one of them talks about, two things. She just walked out the door. I'll come back to that. Two things is, one is there's a frequently asked question about your cloud credits if you don't have the free education community, the problem I mentioned at the beginning of all this. I did put that up here as well, a link to that, so that's under there, give you the instructions on how to correct that. The other thing here is, here we go, number 7, when rendering to the cloud, how do I know how many megapixels I need? So when I expand that, it'll tell you their max print size. So it'll say 12 megapixels will produce a 16 by 24 inch drawing. Obviously you saw the 16 megapixels was the last option or something like that. So obviously you go bigger, it's going to produce a much larger image. But I've noticed that because they are megapixels, when you bring them into Photoshop, you can scale them up and down, and I haven't noticed any kind of loss in quality when you do that. Of course, I haven't gone real big, but I would just always max it out, and then you're covered. But just in case you need to be more efficient, you can check that out. Now if I go back to my render gallery, I guess I already have it open. I'm going to hit F5 to refresh, and then there's my room here. Now you're going to look at this rendering, and you're going to see that it's a little bit brighter, it seems like. So that's one thing I've noticed, is the lights are a lot brighter when they go into the cloud. Another thing you see is my chair is now red instead of being orange. And the ceiling looks a little bit lighter, but the walls look about the same. So we're going to talk about this now because we're going to start talking about materials and some things to look out for when we go into the cloud, because there's going to be some issues with materials that we need to talk about. One thing, I know these computers still do not have the Service Pack 1 and 2 that came out as an update to Revit 2014. That's been on my long list of things that I'm trying to get IT to cover in here. What that means is if you render from not your computer, but if you render from one of these computers, some of your materials, when it goes to the cloud, might be scaled wrong. For instance, stone pavers are going to show up like boulders when they go to the cloud. They scale up by 12. And I've had all these people send me renderings, especially in my class, where I'm like, wow, that scale is just way off, and they've tried to tweak the material, try to change it, and it keeps coming up, that size. Service Pack 1 apparently fixed that problem. Because when I render on my computer, I never have that problem, and I have all the service packs. So with that said, if you have your own computers, you also need to get your updates, and that's also in the frequently asked questions. I'll send you the link, but you need to make sure you download and install Service Packs 1 and 2 just to keep up to date with a lot of your cloud services, and also other things that they kind of fix here. Okay, let's talk about materials, because renderings, what makes the rendering is not only the view and the lighting, but it's what the materials are and how we use the materials. I'm going to go back to this this particular model, and there's two ways of applying materials to a Revit model. The first way is the more standard way that you're probably going to be used to, especially when you're modeling. Let's say I go into level 1, and I've got these wall types. I just happen to model here with the generic 8-inch wall. Let's click this one wall that's behind the chair, kind of the one on the left. I'm going to click Edit Type, and I'm going to choose Duplicate. Let's call this 8-inch test, whatever. What I want to do is I'm going to actually go into the structure of this wall. Remember, we kind of briefly touched on this, that you can add different layers to your wall. Well, adding layers to your wall also allows you to apply a material to it. So right now this wall is 8 inches thick, and if I apply a material to it, it's going to apply that material to both sides of the wall, the whole entire 8 inches. So that means if you wanted a different material on the outside versus what you wanted on the inside, you really needed to set that wall up as our compound walls that we went over at the very beginning, the very first workshop. And I'll go over that here in a minute. Is all you have to do is hit Insert and add another layer. I'm going to move this up to the exterior side, and maybe I'll insert another layer, click on it, and move this down. And then you give each layer a dimension. So it doesn't matter if I was really making a true wall. Let's say this was a chipboard wall. My exterior layer would actually be something like 5/8 of an inch thick. My interior layer is going to be, or my middle is going to be like a 6-inch stud, for instance. And then my other side would be 5/8 of an inch. Anyway, what that's doing is, in Revit, especially in the office, you would typically actually draw all the different layers of your wall so that when you cut sections, when you look at it in floor plan and in section, you see all the different layers of the wall that would make up the construction of it. But that also allows us to differentiate the layers on the materials on one side versus the other. So if my outside, actually if that was going to be more like brick, I might type in 3 5/8, because that's the true depth of a brick. And then I can apply my different materials here. By clicking on the box, when I click in the box here where it says material, I get the little button that pops up, and I can click on that, and it's going to take me into a material dialog box. Your box probably looks maybe something like that. I have a lot of different materials in here. These aren't some of these are the default materials that come with Revit. Others are ones I actually loaded into this project, so we'll talk about those a little bit. Each material has a couple different ways of showing it off. Okay, so if I were to pick a material, so I'm going to pick brick, and I'm not going to scroll through all this because there's a lot of materials there. I'm going to type in brick under my search. And I'm going to find the one here just called masonry brick and click on that. When I click on that, it's going to eventually select that material and place it into that layer. But off to the right, it's going to show me some other information. Under the graphics tab, it's going to show me surface and cut pattern. So whenever I cut this material with a section, or if I cut it in plan, this is the hatch pattern that I want to see when it gets cut. So that's kind of a standard, brick hatch pattern. Or if you wanted it to be some color, you could click on that and change your hatch patterns to whatever comes there. Now you're going to see that Revit obviously only comes with a certain amount of hatch patterns. I could always click on New and make my own hatch pattern with a different scale. So I can change this, but there's only a couple things I can do. I could either do parallel lines or a cross hatch, and that's really it, and I can rotate the lines. So I can go to like 90 degrees, and you're kind of stuck and limited to that level of making your own hatch pattern. Or you can click on Custom, and then you can import a hatch pattern. Now, I'm not going to go into how to make a hatch pattern because you need to be a computer programmer in order to make that happen. And it's the same hatch patterns that come from AutoCAD. If you've ever made a hatch pattern in AutoCAD, I don't know if you have, but you have to write out a text file actually with all these numbers to do it, and it's pretty complicated. Or I've given you in this download today a series of hatch patterns that are for Revit that have some additional options. So if you go to Import and scroll or browse to where you downloaded that zip file, I've provided you with AutoCAD patterns for Revit and Revit pattern package 1 and 2. So if you click on the, I'll do AutoCAD patterns for Revit and click Open. I can now scroll down. You see here on the right, I can scroll down and find, just start showing me a preview of all these different hatch patterns that are available. So obviously there's a lot of options there. But anyway, I can pick from all of those, or I could, look at my other. So again, the way I got to that is I'm here in the Graphics tab under Surface Pattern, or even under my Cut Patterns. I can click on that image, and now I have this dialog box where I can edit, or I can click New, and then I'm going to choose Custom and Import. I'm going to try Revit pattern package number 2. I don't have too many options there, but you kind of get the point. You can find additional options there. Now, some patterns are drafting patterns. That's what the cut patterns are going to be. You notice when we click on that, it says drafting pattern, and model pattern is not, is actually grayed out. A drafting pattern is something that scales based on the scale of your image or your drawing. So as you get more and more in detail to like 3/4 inch, that hatch pattern is going to get closer and closer together, so it shows you a finer level of detail. The difference is under a surface pattern, if I click on that, I can actually make that a drafting pattern or a model pattern. The difference is, first of all, the surface pattern is what this surface is going to look like when you strike an elevation of it or a section and you look at it in your drawing. Do you want it to actually show you a brick pattern because it's brick, so it shows up in your black and white drawing that you're making? So yes, I actually would like that to happen, and that's why it's actually selected as a model pattern, because model patterns are actually true or actual scale. So when I scale my drawing up and down, it's still going to be an 8-inch wide brick by 2 1/4 inch high brick pattern. That brick pattern is never going to scale as far as changing the actual true scale of it. I could actually strike a dimension or scale it with a scale when it prints out, and it'll scale off as 2 1/4 by 8 inches. So the difference, that's kind of the difference between those. So you just kind of have to pick and choose what you want. And you can also then again go to New. I can pick on Custom, and I should have a lot more patterns under my AutoCAD patterns that are model patterns. I can kind of scroll there, and I've got herringbone brick. I've got all these other roof tile and all these other little hatch patterns and other brick patterns that are in that as well. So anyway, a lot of different options there, even stone. So whatever. So anyway, you get the point. You can kind of place that there. The other thing I like to do is when it's a hatch pattern is I always change them to gray. You want your lines that print of your actual perimeter of that wall to be dark, and then you want things that are hatch patterns that are going to fill up your drawing. You really want those to be kind of a light gray, or even a lighter gray perhaps. Now the other part of a material, so that's everything that has to do with anything that you would see in a Revit drawing. The other part is the Appearance tab. The Appearance tab is what you're going to see this pattern as when it renders. So basically everything here is your rendering dialog box, And it is going to have a couple of different options here. You're going to notice there's not a whole lot of different options here for this brick. Revit has tried to keep it pretty simple so that you don't have to tweak so many things in order to get a, something to actually look right. If you've done any rendering in other programs, you apply it as a texture, and then you have to like find the actual scale of your brick and try to scale it down, and you spend about an hour trying to get the brick to look right, and then also wrap a wall correctly. There's a lot of time that goes into it. Revit's already got that taken care of in a lot of these image files. This brick has basically the masonry, but it's tied to an image. And when I click on that image, it takes me to the Revit library of where all the other brick patterns are. Or not all the brick patterns, but all patterns. But you can see I could actually go to this library, and if I wanted to, I could change out the brick to something else. So if I pick another material, I could click open, and it's going to change it to that material. That's basically the texture that's going to get modeled and shown. Now look under relief pattern. I want to also make sure that my relief pattern, which is actually a bump map, and I'll explain that here in a minute, is basically needs to match up with your image. Because a bump map is basically a black and white image of whatever it is, the texture you have. And the way it works is when it renders, Revit gives it, or a lot of rendering engines out there will give it a relief or a bump. So anything that is white is going to bump out, or it's going to look like it's bumping out. Anything that's darker, so like the mortar joints in this particular case, are going to bump in. So even though your wall is completely flat, it's going to give it some texture, and you can tell it the amount to bump. But because I changed this image, and I changed it to brick non-uniform running red, I also want to change this bump map, and each of these images should have a bump map equivalent. You can see the black and white version. So I want to get this other one that's associated with it and match them up. And that's not the right one. There we go. So you just want to make sure you're picking the right bump and the images match up, because obviously the bump, when it bumps out and bumps in, has to match your image so it looks realistic. Otherwise, you're going to get a different random pattern on your surface. I can also change the amount of the bump. So right now it's set to 0.15. I could go all the way to 2, and it'd make it really bump out a lot more. So I can be a little more extreme. Maybe I'll just make it 1 for now, kind of halfway in the middle. And it doesn't really, you can't really tell if it's really doing much or not. Some materials seem to bump better than others, but because this has a lot of grayscale in it in this image, that's why you're not going to get the extremes in the bump. And everyone know how to get your own textures. You can go to anywhere on the internet. I have to be careful when I do this, because you go to Bing Images or you go to Google Images, and we all know what happens, but you get random things when you type in something. But I could type in brick textures, and it should, there you go, that looks pretty safe. That gives you brick textures that I can download. So, essentially you could find, and if you always search with the word textures in it, that is an old term that's associated with 3D Studio Max. So everyone in the world uses 3D Studio Max to do a lot of the renderings that are out there, and that's been around for a long time. So the word texture has been around for quite some time to make special materials, and so this is how you can find basically any image that you want. So I could actually find this brick pattern, and all I would do is save it, and then I could actually, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to pick this one, and you generally want to find, and this has a little banding there at the bottom. That's probably not, I can crop it. But you generally want to find a texture that looks like it's pretty much flat on. You don't want to find something that's skewed, because obviously you want it to be like it's going to be applied to a wall. So this one looks pretty flat on. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as of that. I'll go ahead and let's store that somewhere where I can get to it. Architecture projects. Nope. So I'll save it there. And then what you can do in order to get a bump map version of this is all I do is go into Photoshop and I find the image that I downloaded, drag it into Photoshop, and I can crop it. I'm going to crop out the little banding there. Now, one thing that you have to also keep in mind is the way that it repeats. You can see that if you imagine this is going to be copied, basically this image gets copied over and over again along your entire surface. So you want to sometimes customize it too to make sure that it looks like a good repeat pattern, so you might crop it. You might try to crop it some images are better than others, but you kind of get the point. I probably want to get rid of that top. So I'm going to want to make sure I save that, but the equivalent that I'm going to do is go to Image, Adjust Image, and then I can desaturate it. That makes it black and white, takes out all the color. And then I can play around with the brightness, to get my bump map. So if I want it to be, really drastic, I want it to be really light. If I don't want a whole lot of bump, you probably want it to be a little bit more grayscale. I'm going to bump this up pretty high. Maybe about right there. And this will be my bump. So I'll do a Save As. And what I normally like to do, and this is what Revit does in its own library, is after the same exact title of that particular material, I just do an underscore and type in bump. This way I know that that's the bump material to apply. Now, one other thing you have to know is in order to size this correctly, and I'm not sure exactly the size of these bricks, but if I use a typical module of what I expect a brick to be, I'm going to count across this image. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, let's say 9 bricks. So I know that this wall panel should be, 72 inches wide? So anyway, that should be the width of that. And then I want to count the way, how many bricks I have high. So I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I'm going to pull out a calculator for this one. 21 times 2.25-ish. Let's say it's going to be, I'll just round it up to 48 inches. So I'm going to write that down. That's going to be 72 inches wide by 48 inches high is what I would expect the scale of this image to be if it was to be applied in real life. So this goes along for every single material, especially when you get into carpet, like if you're going to get carpet squares, and I've got some materials of that. You know that a carpet square is 2 foot by 2 foot, and if you get a pattern of them from an image, and you have two and two together, you know your image needs to be scaled, 4 foot by 4 foot, something like that. So just keep in mind what the true size of these things should be, because when we go back into Revit, I'm going to now change this pattern, and I'm going to do this in the wrong way first. Where it says masonry brick, I'm going to keep that name there. I'm not going to duplicate this. What I'm going to tell you is when we do materials, you're going to make sure you want to duplicate before we do things, and I'll show you why in a minute. So I got my masonry brick, and then I'm going to go over here to my image, and now I'm going to load up that file we just downloaded. So the color image will go up there, and then the bump map will go down below where it says relief. That guy. But you can see that the image looks like it's been squished down and squished together. These little down arrows to the right, if I click on them, I can go all the way down to the bottom and click Edit Image. When I'm in this dialog box, I can kind of expand this, you can see there's dimensions of the height and the width that are applied to it. All I have to do now is go down here where it says Scale, and I'm going to uncheck the little lock here to the right. And I'm going to change my sample size. The width is going to be 72 inches, and my height was going to be 48 inches. Now I've scaled that correctly, and every time I apply this, it's going to look correct in the model. So I don't know if you've played around with Rhino and other rendering programs, but you have to do all these like weird things to scale your textures correctly. This is going to be scaled exactly the way that it's measured. Now, what's important here is when I'm done with that, I also have to make sure I do the same thing down below at the scale of the relief pattern so that they match up. Otherwise, you're going to get the weird kind of overlay. So again, that one needs to be 72 inches by, what, 4 feet? And click Done. So now we've got that applied, and I'm going to click OK. And remember, the whole time we were in this wall, we were actually in that part of the layer, you know, the 3 5/8 layer that we made, and I just applied that material to that side. Now the other side that's on the back, I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to just find a material that's already in here. I should have some paints, I think. I'm going to find the one here called Sassy Green P220, or you could type in Sassy Green. Those are actual Sherwin-Williams paint colors, which, by the way, you can go to their website and download a Photoshop color palette from them, and it has every single paint color that they sell in there. You can click on it, and it tells you the RGB value. So what's great about that is I use that all the time, you know, especially when you're doing all your interior renderings for a client and you're trying to show them the, you know, your color scheme and exactly what you're putting into their project. I'm sitting there showing them, yeah, this is, you know, Sassy Green, or, you know, whatever it happens to be. This is what it's going to look like. It's going to be close in the rendering, but it's going to be a pretty close match to what you might expect to see in real life. Of course, we all know lighting, you know, plays different, kind of plays around with that when we're dealing with real lights. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and select that. I'll hit OK, and that'll be the inside of my wall, and then I'll close out of that. Now I'm going to turn this into a fine view, because what I want to do is make sure that my brick is on the right side, and it is. So my brick ended up on the exterior side. If it didn't, I could hit the space bar and just flip it. So actually, I'm going to flip it in because I want to look at that brick since we just spent all that time making it. And I'm going to change this wall type over to that same brick as well. So now I can go back and look at my view. Now I've got the brick pattern there. And notice it still looks like it's red in there, and it has a little hatch pattern. But that's all because of, and I don't have to go back into that wall type to figure this out. I can go to Manage and click on Materials, and that will bring up that dialog box again. And then I can go find my brick. I guess I should type it in. That's because under the Appearance tab, this is the look that I had for the rendering. But when I go back under Graphics, it still remembers the RGB value that was shown there. I could actually use the Render Appearance as a option there, and what it tries to do is average all the colors of your material, or I could go ahead and you know, change this over there, and all that's doing is changing it in this view, but not necessarily the rendering. So now I'm going to go ahead and hit View, and I'm going to render the first one here in the computer. So I've still got all my same settings here, and I'll hit Render. This might take a little bit longer because I'm adding, you know, materials now. Okay, that's one way of adding the materials. So, you know, we had to go into the wall and we had to go into the structure and add that. It's the same method for working with floors and ceilings. You would have to click on the actual floor and then go into the structure and add some floor to it. So after this is done, we'll add a wood floor. And then we're going to send the same thing up to the cloud because I want to show you something, the error that you will probably encounter many times unless you are aware of this as an issue. The issue is, since we're kind of going through here, is when you send information to the cloud, it actually uses the materials and everything that came with Revit on their server up there, wherever that might be located. So if I made a change to masonry brick and I kept the same name of masonry brick and I didn't change it or do anything unique to it, When it goes up to the cloud, it's going to override it and change it back to what it was supposed to be originally. So if you went around and tweaked all these materials and added all this stuff to it, as soon as it goes to the cloud, if you didn't do anything with those names, it's going to be basically overwritten. So what that means is, and this is taking a little bit longer than I expected, but essentially what that means is every time we make a new material, if you're ever going to make a tweak to it, I would recommend, or I would say you definitely have to do this, duplicate the material, and we'll go over this as soon as this is done. You duplicate it, and then you make it a unique name so that Revit does not when it goes to the cloud, it doesn't overwrite it. I found that out the hard way. It was horrible. I was getting ready for a presentation, and I had all this like really cool stuff that I did with my materials, and I kept sending it to the cloud because I was on time crunch, and nothing was coming out the way it should. I'm like, what is going on? It took me 2 hours to figure it out. I finally figured out if I changed the name, then it was good. But it would have been nice if they told you that somewhere on the screen, but you find that out the hard way. So I'm at 57% here. Shoot. I should have probably downgraded my quality for this one. But here we go. We're getting a little bit better. So you can start to see now we're adding these textures and materials. Revit is taking a little bit more time now to calculate and do the rendering. But you can start to see there with the brick, you get a little bit of depth there, based on that bump. So maybe you can kind of see that. And my pattern repeat looks pretty good. I do have kind of a vertical line right there, but anyway, you just have to kind of play around with when you're making your own materials, how to get that repeat to work. One reason I'm showing you how to make your own materials is because I want you guys to truly make your own materials half the time, especially for studio, because a lot of the stuff that comes in Revit, I mean, they're pretty decent materials. They actually share the same material palette with 3D Studio Max. So some things, you don't have to make, like a wood floor, but I know your projects, you're looking at unique probably materials on certain instances. You probably want to find that stone that you want, or whatever the image is of that brick that you've been modeling around, or whatever it might be, metal panel, and make it unique to yourself. I'm going to pause this video for a second because or can I cover something else? See, this is the problem with the rendering here. So actually, I'm going to cancel this because you get the idea here with the brick, but take note of this brick. I'm going to cancel this, and then let's send the same thing over to the cloud. I guess I could save what I have. You could also hear the fan on my computer kind of kicked in. Had to really start working there. That's using straight processor speed on your computer when it renders. So if you're wondering what makes if you want a computer that renders really quick, make sure you have the latest and greatest processor. RAM has nothing to do with it. Only RAM is used for when you're kind of moving around and maneuvering in the Revit model, but when you render, it's using your processor. So again, I'm going to hit Render in Cloud. Got everything set up. And I can make sure always make sure you change it to native, and then I'll go ahead and start the rendering. The option there for the interactive panorama, that's part of that dialog box. That is a really cool feature. It's kind of left over from the 3D Studio days. You could actually export a camera view, and if you export it or use that option as an interior or an interactive panorama, it takes a 360-degree rendering from that camera point. It then gives you either an AVI file, I think it gives you a QuickTime movie file. And so when you open up that QuickTime movie file, you can literally pan around in orbit and look around like if you were moving that camera around in 360 degrees. So it's kind of a neat little, like if you wanted to give someone, like, hey, here's a room and you want to look around, but you don't want to give them the model to do that, you give them that, and they can actually see a fully rendered room, and they can just kind of look around just like in a video game. If you were looking around with your person, that's what they would get. So it's kind of a neat feature, and if it's free, you guys might want to try it out too. It might be a cool way to also present some of your projects in the future.
So you take a perspective view to cloud and do it?
Yeah, so when I go back to Render in Cloud, and whoops, there's my gallery. this step here where it says output type is a still image. If you change that to interactive panorama, it'll do that. It'll take a lot longer to produce because it actually has to render like quadrants of from all different ways, but it's kind of a cool feature.
It also, you can get, I think, 4.
Have you done it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It either gives you 4 or 6 files that are like kind of stretched portions of the panorama, and so you can actually like stitch together like a horizontal image if you want to, I think.
And there used to be a way in 3D Studio Max that you could, if you batched rendered, and I haven't tried it here, maybe I need to experiment with it, but if you had 2 camera views, you know how you can batch render, like I said, view number 1 and view 2. I think what it does is it gives you a little point in your interactive panorama that if you click on, you kind of walk to it, and then it takes you to the next point. That used to be how it did it in 3D Studio, so I don't know if that's quite all here, but it might be something you guys play around with if you really want to get into some cool stuff.
Do you know any way in an exterior rendering, like if your topography, you know how when you do, like it doesn't extend to the horizon line and it kind of drops off? Do you know if there's any way to
Change that background?
Yeah.
Yeah, there isn't, and it's you notice like when we did the exterior rendering, my topography stopped and then it was gray.
Yeah,
it's going to be
some programs you can make like a fake.
Yeah, you could do like an infinite plane. So what I would suggest is you kind of mimic the same thing. If you ever do the infinite plane in Rhino, all it's doing, if I go into a plan view,
Make it really big.
it's just like zoom in so like really, really far out and just go ahead and make a big box that's a little bit lower, like make it big, like a big floor. That's a little bit lower than the lowest point of your topography, so that you still get the rest of your topography. And then when it drops off, you know, if your topography extends far enough, you know, it'll look like it's continuing on, you know, in the horizon. That's the best way to do it, to trick it. And usually, what I do is I put a lot of trees at the end, just to give it something, or a building, or give it some context, so you don't really ever see the horizon line.
Yeah.
That's kind of a good trick. So I should be able to, let me see if this rendered, and then we'll, we got 440. So actually, maybe everything I just told you might be false. That's weird. Because there's the same brick. My chair is still red, but maybe they fixed that bug. Huh. I would still, just to be safe, let's duplicate it, but that's pretty cool. I know that people have been complaining about this for a long time, and they keep saying that they've, now did you guys, anyone send it up, did it overwrite? Because maybe I have the latest service packs, maybe that has been fixed in one of the service packs. So anyway, if you kind of look and study and see if that works. Anyway, that seemed to look pretty good there. The reason my chair is turning out, so it did override it back. Did you try to apply a new brick, or you're using, okay. All right, so the reason my chair is red up here is because in my model, when I click on this chair, and this is going to be a good kind of good lesson with families, is that I've shown you how to apply materials here on the wall by going into it and adding it into the structure. And I mentioned, we could do the same thing with the floor. So if I tab over, maybe select it in 3D. So if I select the floor and click Edit Type, I could add in a new material here. Another way of adding materials, I'm actually going to temporarily hide this ceiling. I'm going to turn on a shaded view.
I think you have 2 layers.
Yeah, I have 2 ceilings in there, don't I? Somewhere's my chair. There it is. So if I wanted to apply materials, there's another way to do it without having to go into the structure of everything, like I just said, and you had to set up different sides. There's this option here under Modify, and it's probably best to be in like a 3D view or something when you're doing this. But there's this little button over here under Geometry and it's called paint. This is exactly like, when you click on that, exactly like in SketchUp, how you apply textures and things on all your different model parts. So I'm going to pick, now the only thing that you have to remember here is you have to have the material created first before you can actually select it here in this option. But I'm going to go down here and I'm going to select wood flooring, and I'm going to hover over the floor and I'm going to paint it. And you can apply materials that way too. So that would be one way if you wanted brick on the outside and a painted, chipboard surface on the inside. You could just go around and paint it. It's just not going to look like it when you cut it in section, because all it's doing is applying it to the outside face of that wall.
But it would render with what you had painted with last?
Yeah, it'll render and also show when you're looking at it in elevation. Like if I painted this, I should be able to paint this other one. Well, yeah, actually I've got a wood pattern in this floor. So when I go into a floor plan, you can see there all the horizontal lines. So even the hatch pattern and that was associated with it will show up. But I don't think when you cut a section through it, yeah, you're not going to see that cut pattern, because obviously it's not cutting through any kind of thickness. So I've got the wood floor, I did that, but the lesson I wanted to indicate was also about when you start bringing in all this extra geometry. So like you want to bring in furniture, you want to bring in other components like a car or whatever it might be. All of these components have their materials applied to them in the family environment. So if I go to level 1 and I click on this chair and go to edit family, here's the chair. All of these parts and pieces, so when I click on it, there's a material parameter, and it's just like your layers. That's where you would set the material. Or what I typically do is I hit this little button here and I create a new, in whatever family I might be in, I create a parameter called material. Okay, I've already done that for this chair, but I make every component that I want to control a parameter, if I want different materials or whatever, but all of these are equal to that parameter. So when I bring this back in, and I'm not going to load it back in because it's already in there, when I click on this chair, now look to the left, I have a material option here, and it's saying that it's mango whatever, but it's some kind of fabric that I have in here that when I click on this, I can now apply whatever material I have in this environment to that family. So that's the one trick, is that a lot of these family components, you either have to live with what somebody already set up, assuming they did set up some kind of materials. The second option is you go in there and you start to customize it yourself, so you can get it to be whatever color you want. The reason that it's showing up red when it goes to the cloud is because under my mango pattern, so here's mango, I go to appearance, I actually have a red image that's been applied to this fabric tablecloth, and that's just kind of the image of this fabric, but I colored it orange, and it shows up orange here, and I faded out the image fade, so I made the image fade go to 0, so I didn't have any of the red. And when I render on my computer, it doesn't render the image, it just keeps the fabric texture in there, and so on. But when it goes to the cloud, it doesn't recognize that feature, and so all I'm going to do is click on that and hit remove image, but I'm going to still keep the image that was associated with the bump, because now I can just color the bump, whatever orange color I had, and then I got that fabric look on that chair, and I'll maybe make this real fuzzy, go up to 1,000, click OK. Now when I render to the cloud again, my chair should show up orange, and I'll do that real quick, go to view, render in cloud. But there's an example of something that wasn't looking right because the way I had it, the material actually set up. We'll just keep it at that. Does anyone have any basic questions so far about materials? There's going to be one more thing I want to show you on materials that's kind of a cool feature. But just the idea of materials so far, does that seem self-explanatory so far?
I wasn't able to get the paint to work on the floor.
You couldn't get the paint to work on the floor? Even like, see, sometimes you might have to tab over So if you're in a perspective view, go ahead and you can stay in that view you're in, or even that view. You have to
Floor, right?
you have to click the paint icon first.
Click it.
Yeah. So go to view, go to modify, paint icon, and then when this loads up, you need to select a material. So go ahead and select something, and then when it's selected, so I scroll down, to like wood floor. Don't hit done.
Now
Select, and then when you're done selecting all the parts and pieces, you hit done. Yep.
paint and select item.
Yep. Yeah. If you can't select your different components, that's probably why there. So back to the cloud. Hit refresh. So there's my everything's orange now, but there's my wood floor. I got my orange chair, my orange wall. So obviously I'm using a lot of orange here. Probably should have done something different, but I definitely got my chair working the way that I want it. So let's go ahead and make one of these walls. How should we do this? Actually, I'm going to make another ceiling that's going to be below these lights, and we're going to make it into a perforated metal component. Everyone likes to put perforated metal somewhere in their project. One thing about it is if you know your ultimate plan is going to be to render a view, then what I'm about to show you is going to save you a lot of time instead of modeling perforated metal. I know a lot of people do that in Rhino and other programs. But if you sit there and model perforated metal, one, that takes a lot of time, but number two, it also takes up a lot of memory in your model and makes your rendering also take a lot of time in order to produce. So what I'm going to do is, in this model, I'm going to go to level 1 ceiling plan. I'm going to create another ceiling. So if I go to architecture ceiling, and I'm going to do this by a sketch. And I'm also going to hit edit type on this, whatever happened to be selected, my 2x4. I'm going to duplicate this, and let's call it perforated metal ceiling. Now I'm going to change, I'm going to delete actually one of these layers. And I'm just going to keep the one that's 1 inch and 5/8. Or actually, let's change that to be like 1/2 inch. Still a pretty thick piece of metal, but anyway, 1/2 inch. And I'm going to change this where it says default for the material. Go ahead and click in that button. And I'm going to make a brand new material that has what's called basically a cutout. Now, a cutout, this is part of the images that or the files that you downloaded. It's a texture. So here's a texture. I'll either use that one, or I have another one here, perforated squares. In order for this to work, you basically need a black and white drawing, and whatever is black is going to go away once it's rendered. So you could actually make your own perforated metal. If you go into Photoshop, you can go ahead, or whatever program you want, you can go ahead and just as long as things are white and things are black, just think about whatever's white is going to be what remains and is going to be the solid. So I can.
Can you go back to like what should be selected when we're actually searching for the pattern?
Yeah, so I haven't gotten there yet. So this is something I downloaded from the again like Bing Images or something like that. I did perforated metal textures, and you end up with something like this. And so, make sure you have it where you can we can eventually browse to it. What I'm going to do is down here at the bottom, there's this little plus button next to a sphere. You click on that, and now you can create a new material. By creating a new material, I'm going to give this a name, so I'll right-click on it, and let's call it perforated metal. And then I can go into the Appearance tab, and now, because I'm making a brand new material, look at all the different options I have that are associated with it. So I have reflectivity, transparency, cutout, self-illumination. You can make things glow if you want. You also can give it a tint, and you also have your bump map. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply that, you can kind of see the little Death Star image up there. I'm going to apply what's called a cutout by using that image. First thing I'm going to do is actually turn the color of that generic, where it says generic color. I'm going to choose white, so it brightens up a little bit there so we can see it. And then I'm going to go to cutout, and when I expand that, I can add an image. And it says no image selected. If you just click on that word, I have to hit the checkbox, then it'll allow me to add in a perforated or any kind of image. So I'm going to pick the one here called perforated squares and click open. Notice what happens to my little Death Star up there. Basically, you can see that it has a bunch of holes in it now where this was cut out, basically anything that was black. So if I want to size that, I'm going to click on that down arrow and hit edit image. I'm going to say that maybe this should be a little bit bigger. Let me just do 2 foot by 2 foot. And again, that's the overall image of the of that whole entire image, but that gives me probably a better spacing. And
Do that again, if you don't mind.
click on the little arrow here and click edit image, and then down, you might have to scroll down on your dialog box. You have the sample size scale, and you can change that.
What'd you change it to?
I just did 3 foot square. And then I can go ahead and click, just go ahead and click OK, and that's all we need for at the moment. You could give it some, glossiness or make it metal, so I can make it metallic, whatever. And then go ahead and click OK, and OK again, and keep going. Now I'm going to place this at, let's say, 8 feet. And I'm going to put it over in this corner. I'm just going to make a rectangle kind of over that chair spot. And now when I look at my view, I might raise that up. Let's raise it up to like 9 feet. So now I can go ahead and render this, and let's send it to the cloud and see if that does better. I'm going to change this wall, flip it to sassy green. There we go. And then I'll go ahead and hit render in cloud. I could also hit, probably do it in here, but it'll probably take too long. So anyway, what you should get is a rendered image that shows the perforated squares, and whatever was black, you're going to see right through it, and the light's going to go through it, and everything's going to kind of work in there. And so any place that you want perforated metal or any kind of design, you could use that cutout option, and then you save yourself a lot of time if you know that your final product's going to be rendered. Looks like I'm getting bumped down the line here, 1 hour. So anyway, while that's rendering, and we can kind of check back up on that progress, any other questions about just rendering in general? That's kind of the quick gist of materials, how to apply them, how to use them, how to use the camera, do the interior renderings, and also the exterior renderings. I guess the one thing that I didn't explain is when you're using these lights, I'm just going to pick on this light. All of your lights are a family. And when you're in a family, if you want to change any of the characteristics of a light, let's say you download a light from somewhere, and this happens a lot. I might download a light from a manufacturer, and I really like the light fixture, but whatever their light settings were that they inputted into it just isn't making my rendering look good, then I might go in and kind of change it so that I can at least get the nice shot. Each lighting family is made up of, you can see this little orange or yellow kind of light globe If you click on that, that's your light source definition, and all lights will have that. And you can change the size of your light, or how you can change it from being a point light to a linear light to area light or some kind of sphere. You can make it go up and down. You can be a spotlight. And this other one's the photometric. That's usually the one that most lighting manufacturers have it already tied to some kind of file. But again, if you want to change the way that these lights work, generally for interior renderings, I'll tell you right now that the area light and this coming down is usually your best one because it gives you an overall illumination. But if you wanted to really highlight something, then you'd really want to go to that cone light, and then you have to play around with some of the functions of that. The other part of that is when you go into the family types dialog box over here, this is where your light has a set of parameters, but the one that you're most interested in are right down here where it says photometrics. There's a light loss factor, initial intensity, and initial color. Let's say you brought in lights from, especially Revit, when you get their standard lights, all of their lights are really, really yellow. So when you do a rendering, your rooms look real yellow because it's some kind of incandescent lights or whatever. So what I like to do is where it says initial color, is if you click on that, it'll give you this little picture of some flowers, but you can change the color preset to different bulbs. So a lot of times I like to find the fluorescent daylight, and that gives you a white light. Or you can go to halogens, or whatever you want to do. There's I don't know if this has been updated to, I don't see LED in there, but you got xenon, that's pretty close to LED. But you can see that the color temperature changes for each one. Or you could do a custom, and I could just change my 6000K, and I'm not going to explain all that, but basically the higher the number, looks like if I go to 2000, whoops, the higher the number, the wider the light, the lower the number, the closer to yellow or red you get. I'm not sure what the exact true science to all of that is, but you guys could look that up. But that's all you need to know, is the higher you go, it's going to be a wider and wider light. So if your colors aren't looking right because of the lighting, that might be something you need to change. The other thing is the initial intensity. I'm not going to get into all this, but you could change the wattage. We're all familiar with wattage. I bumped this up to like 200 watts almost. But if you think about it, it depends on, this is like a 2x4 fluorescent light fixture, and it had 4 different bulbs in it. And so if you kind of figure each one was like 50 watts or whatever, I might have an overall luminance of 200 watts. So anyway, but the point is, if you just want to make your lights brighter, just go ahead and up the wattage, and you can make that lighter. And then the other thing is about your light loss factor. If it's set to 1, that means basically the light loss factor is from the source of the light. As it starts to go through the space, it's going to start losing some of its light intensity as it gets further and further away from the light. That's how Revit's calculating, the photometrics. So if you keep it at 1, it'll be kind of a constant drop. If you go dimmer, it's going to, go fade out quicker. So it may not, if you go too dim, it may not illuminate the floor, if your space is too high. Or if you go brighter, obviously, you're going to start out a lot more intense, and then it won't, you won't really lose a lot of light as it goes all the way through. I don't really ever play around with these other options. Actually, if you keep that on simple, that's all you have to really deal with. But anyway, if you get lights from other sources, that's maybe some of the settings that you have to create or adjust before you bring them in. Check on that rendering real quick. Hit refresh. So there's my perforated squares. Looks like it's rendering kind of blurry there.
I'm rendering pretty good.
Okay, yeah, you got a little bit larger scale. So maybe my scale of my perforations are too small there, but you also get the idea that even with the smaller perforations, you can kind of get this nice, look through that element.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
If you have a funny shape and you apply that, like, what's the difference between doing that and what we showed, like the first class, where you built these components and
Right. So if you got a, let's say a complex shape, that image is going to contort to the shape. The difference is this is only showing up in a rendering. It is going to make it quicker to render versus if you do all those components and then try to render those, because it has to calculate all those different items and components. But you know, you're going to have to manually make some kind of perforated cutout in order to make that render right. But if you want to do something real quick and you didn't want to go through all those curtain panels like we did in the second class, you could apply a cutout and kind of get a similar idea. The one thing that you're going to be limited to is your material can only be white or black, you know, on that. So if you want different materials and other things applied to it, you'd have to really want those curtain panels instead.
So my question is about, like, I think a lot of us have talked about perforated metal on the exterior. And this example is pretty detailed, like a larger, you'd be closer to the material, you know, based on the size of the image. But if we're doing like elevations, is it really worthwhile to even bother rendering the material as perforated metal if there's no changing pattern? Like if it was all of the even pattern?
So you're talking about just like a black and white elevation? Or
even a color elevation, but like, would you just like, does it really make a lot of a difference, or would you just like apply a texture in Photoshop?
Well, you can, there's two parts to that question is, if you're doing an elevation in Revit, it's a black and white elevation. So right here you would see this.
Yeah.
So if you wanted it to look perforated just in this particular elevation, you would actually do the surface pattern that we went over as a hatch. So you could come up with a crosshatch that would look like perforated metal. That's typically what you do kind of in construction documents. But see, you could go into view, and you can't render an elevation. But if you went into a 3D view like this axon and turn the cube, I should pay attention there, and view it directly on as an elevation, you can render this elevation, and then you could actually use this cutout option, you know, to get it to look right, and you might get the shadows and things like that once you put the light on there. One thing that's nice about this as well is when you have the sun settings, one option with the sun settings, you know, we went over specific sun settings, but when you're doing an elevation view, you know, you're not going to try to get 3 o'clock sun or the 2 o'clock sun. Revit gives you the ability to do suns from the top right or sun is from the top left. So basically, wherever the camera view is, or where you're viewing this, it's either going to give you shadows this way or the other way, kind of diagonal down. So you could turn that on and then do a rendering, and if you have the perforated cutout, then you would have that layering effect. Make sense? We still have about 30 or 25 minutes here. Anything else on rendering? Because I want to quickly go over structure and how to use some of the structure tools and all that. So everyone's good? I did give you guys links to some of my other rendering videos that kind of cover all this in a little more detail. So again, I'll give you those again in the web page that you can go to, and then you guys can see all of that information as well. Let's see here.
You were talking about different kinds of hosts for lights. Do most manufacturers host their lights in ceilings? Is that how it?
Actually, the norm now has been doing face-based, which means it doesn't matter where you put the light. You could put it on a wall, floor, or up on the ceiling. It's just reading a face. And then pretty much everyone's doing the face-based, unless it's could be a free-floating light or something that's hanging from somewhere. You know, they might just do like one that floats. One thing is, if you go to Insert on Revit, there's this little search bar up here called Autodesk Seek. If I type in light, this takes me to Autodesk Seek's website, And this is where you can find a lot of family components that are Autodesk approved. Like you have to model your family in a specific way to their standards in order for it to actually make it onto this site. But this is where you'll find a lot of manufacturer material. So one thing I'll have to say is I always recommend that you model your own families, and that'll be another workshop coming up, but model your own families as it pertains to your own architecture. But when you're getting into lights, and unless you're doing some kind of custom light and furniture and trying to complete your scene, that's when you go and you find things on the internet and bring it in, because you shouldn't be spending your night trying to model a chair or a computer table or something like that. There's already people that have probably done that. So I always go to Autodesk Seek first and type in what I want, and then you can download. You can see where it says RFA as a file. That's your RFA family type for Revit, and you can just go ahead and download that somewhere on your computer. So you could search through all those lights and then kind of play around. Another one that then what I like to do so I go to Autodesk Seek. That's my first place I go. The next place would be I'd go to a specific manufacturer, and instead of going to their website and clicking and trying to figure out where they hid all the BIM content, I usually just type in whatever the manufacturer is. So I'm going to do Del Rey lighting, and I'm going to do BIM. We'll just say BIM, or you could also type in Revit. Oops. And that usually takes you to where they've got all of their lighting families. That's not it. Yeah. Let's see. I got BIM. For some reason I changed something. Hold on. The reason I'm showing you Del Rey is they've got some really, really cool lights that basically, if you can download their BIM content, their models are pretty nice, and they're very special featured lights that I actually used up at the Uptown YMCA when we just did that project. But let's see, did I close out of that already? Go back to Del Rey.
So most of the time you can find something that's hosted the way you need it.
Yeah. And then you can bring that in. I won't spend any more time on that. BIM Revit. So anyway, there's some of the lights, but you can download these things and bring them in, and then you have the ability to really have some really nice models that look like you thought about your lighting. Also, it helps you in your design process because we were trying to figure out how to use some unique light fixtures throughout some of our projects. So it gives you the way to also help your client visualize what you're talking about, that they need to spend $10,000 on this light, or whatever it is you're trying to convince them to do. So it's a good way to do that. But again, it makes your models pretty cool, especially when you start to render. The last option, and I'll caution you on this one, is if you go to Revit City, and all of you may have already gone there before, but you can create a username and password here. It's free. This is a forum type setup for Revit content. So you might find people that are complaining about having an issue with something, and then you can find a solution to it by someone else answering it. But you can also find downloads. So I can click on downloads, and then you could type in, light, and you can find a bunch of different families as well. You can find all different types of products here. The caution here is sometimes you can find the manufacturer product. Sometimes you find someone who decided to model it on their own and they uploaded it here. The issue with that is sometimes you get really good things that you download, and other things are just not usable. So you will end up spending a little bit more time, playing around with whatever you downloaded to see if it, works for you. But again, I would recommend furniture, lighting, coffee cups, whatever you're trying to do to show your scene. Put books on a shelf, whatever it is. That's where you download all this information from. Let's talk about structure. Any questions about this? So what makes a rendering is lighting, materials, and entourage. Entourage is the people, the cars, all these little random objects that complete a scene. Obviously, if you're doing this room, you'd want to show computer monitors and things like that in your project to get a good feel for what the room should look like. So I don't really need all this open anymore. So I'm just going to actually close out of all of this. And you're going to probably wonder how we're going to go over structure in about 15 minutes. But there's a reason that we can do that. I'm going to go to architecture template. Now don't be confused here that there's a structural template. That's just a different way that Revit is set up, has different things in it. We're always going to be modeling in the architectural template. We can still do structures within this model. So what I'm going to do is, let's go into a north elevation. I'm going to move my level 2. I'm just going to make that like 15 feet. And then I'm also going to copy that datum just so I have another one up there called level 3. And I'm not going to worry about it being a floor plan. So I go to level 1. First thing I'm going to do is make some columns, and then we'll make some beams that connect to it. One thing that Revit likes to do, you can place columns by themselves, but Revit likes to host things to a grid. So there's this option over here under architecture, or if you're in the structure tab, off to the right there's datums and there's a grid. Like all projects, you have a column grid, and I don't know if you guys have gotten into that at all in your, have you guys? Okay, so in your projects you have column grids, and typically and I'm just placing, I'm drawing lines here. And as I place them, they're going to start with number 1 and then number 2, 3, and 4. And I think we all know that. I'm going to go ahead and just copy these over a couple times. So I'm just going to do some grids like that. Typically, your grids that are running vertical are going to be numbered. So I've got 1, 5, and 6 here just because of the way I placed them. And the ones that are horizontal are typically like a letter. So you can just click on these little bubbles, and I can type in, this one's going to be A. Whoops, should have had caps. The next one will be B and C. And now I can change, this is 1, the next one here will be number 2, and then number 3. Now I can click on any of these column grids, and off to the left I can click on the other side if I want to show the bubbles on each side, and it's going to show you the bubble, whatever you named that column grid. So it's not like the bubbles are independent. They're all kind of connected together to that column line. And obviously you can't have duplicate. I couldn't have a C and a C or a 2 and a 2. So once I have a column grid, then I can actually start to place some columns. And columns are placed under the structure tab. Now don't be confused here. This is the first thing that everyone gets confused about. Is under the architecture tab, there's also a column. And also if I click on the down arrow, it says structural column and column architectural. Well, when I just pick the one that's up here without the pull down menu, it's going to automatically be modeling a architectural column. The difference is an architectural column would be something like, one of those ornate columns that you'd see on classical architecture, or could be whatever shape you wanted it to be. But when an architectural wall hits the architectural column, they will fuse together and kind of trim each other, together. So basically, if you were trying to get a wall to connect to a column and you really wanted that to happen, then you would pick those. But typically, you want your architectural and your structural columns to be, separate, and you don't want them to have any kind of effect on one another. So I'm going to actually go to the structure tab and choose column. And then over to the left, you'll see that I can choose a 10 by 33 or a 10 by 49. And you're probably saying, well, there's only a couple options there, so I have to use those. But essentially, Revit, as always, is going to start out with a couple options. But what we can do is click on load, or load our family. And I'm going to choose down here under structural columns. I'm going to find steel, and you can see everything that I'm doing in steel, you can do in these other materials: concrete, light gauge steel, precast concrete, and wood. So if you have a wood structure, this is the same philosophy. I'm going to go to steel, and then I'm going to find the W wide flange column, because I'm going to use W sections in this. And when I click open, it gives me a menu of every possible W member that was ever out there. And what's nice about this is tied to true steel standards. So you are picking a W member that actually exists. You're not drawing something that doesn't exist. Why were you guys laughing?
We've been drawing things that don't exist.
You've been drawing things that don't exist. Okay, so now you'll know what a W44 by whatever is. You'll actually have the true size here. So you'll be good to go. Note, though, as you scroll down, there are some here that say obsolete. So you're probably wondering why they threw those in there. And the reason for that, and you'll find this a lot in these structural menus, is obviously if you're modeling an existing building. So I have a project I'm going to do a renovation in, and I got a set of as-built. I'm going to model that structure and all the information that goes in that building so I fully understand it and can work in it. There might have been one of these W members that existed back in 1940 or whenever it is that I need to use, and so that's why they throw those up there. But they tell you it's obsolete just in case you try to use it again. You know it doesn't exist. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to pick a couple columns here that would probably be more typical to a project. So let's say a 12 by 35. I'm going to hold in the control key, and I can pick other ones. I could do a 12 by, let's do 65. Go to 14 by 26. And I'll do one last one here called, let's do 18 by 35. So anyway, you can hit the control button and pick as many of these columns as you want, and go ahead and click open, and then just tell it to overwrite the version. That's fine. Now when you go to your placing your column, you now have all those things that you just loaded in there. So the reason they do that is obviously that you don't want to have every possible W section already loaded into your project. You want to be able to just pick the ones that you're really ever going to need, because you're not going to have more than, probably no more than 10 different shapes throughout a project. So now once I have that, I can pick, I'll pick a 18 by 35, for instance, and I can place these in a couple different ways. Number one, I'm going to change in my option bar, I'm going to change this to height, because I want it to go up 9 feet from wherever I am, and we can change the constraints of this later. But I can place this column where I can snap to the grid, or I could place it where it's not on the grid, but I'll explain that here in a minute. And notice when I look at this, it doesn't look like much to it. That's because I'm in a coarse level of detail view, and when I turn it into a fine, I actually get the true shape of the W member. Now because this one is on a column line, if I were to move this column line, all those columns move with it. So that's the nice thing is, and I didn't have to align that and lock it or anything, it just automatically knows that. The nice thing is, obviously, if you have a column grid and you've got a lot of columns that you've already placed and you're still playing around with whether that column should be 1 foot here or 2 feet over here, as long as they're all on a grid, you're able to manipulate them and move them. Whereas this one is always going to stay where it is.
How come I can't see the column?
So if you can't see the column, remember when I placed the column, I chose under the option bar to place it where it says height, and I made this unconnected 9 feet. If you didn't do that, so you did that, now place it, so now you see it. If you did the other option, which is depth, means it's starting at this location and going down, and the view range for this view doesn't allow you to see all the way through it, so you may have to change your view range to kind of see that. But what I'm going to do is quickly copy this over, but I'm also going to show you another method of doing these columns, so I'll do just those three over there. The other way that you can place columns is I could click on column, and over here where it says at grids, so if you already have column grids, you just go ahead and select all of my column grids, and it's going to place a column at every intersection, and then I can hit finished. So that's another reason to do grids, is you can quickly lay out your grid and then just select all the grids, and then all of a sudden you've got your columns at least placed in those locations. So I'm going to go to View, and I'm going to look at this in 3D. So there's all my columns. And I might now once I've placed them, I can click on a column and I get my constraint properties for each one. So I could actually change, that the top level of all of these, maybe I'll select them all. The top level is actually level 3, and there's no top offset, and all of those go up to that datum. So when I'm moving my floors up and down, all of that changes. So next thing is I'm going to go to level 2, and I'm going to draw the basically the structural floor members that are going to be associated with this little model here. I'm going to first draw a structural floor. I'm going to click on Structure and click on Floor. And the reason I want a structural floor is I want this one called 3-inch lightweight concrete on 2-inch metal deck, because it's actually going to show me this in the section, which is going to be kind of cool. So I'll click on that. I'm just going to draw this with an offset of 1 foot. I'm going to pick each of my column lines, and what that does is it allows me to offset 1 foot from the column line, so that will be my edge of slab, and I can just make this a closed shape. If you use the pick lines command, it should do that. The other thing is I'm going to hit the checkbox, and that will be done. And if I look at this in 3D, there's my floor. And when I look at the floor, you notice I don't see anything different about it. It's just a slab that's up there. But if I actually go to the second floor plan and I cut a section through it, so this will show up in all your sections, and I look at that section and turn the section into a fine level of detail, there's my corrugated floor slab. So it'll show up correctly in wall sections and things like that. So that's kind of a nice feature of that. And there's a way to change that profile, but you can do research on that. But that's usually a typical floor slab detail that you would see, as you move up in a structure. The last thing I'm going to do, now notice I'm going to measure this floor slab. When I measure it, it's 5 inches deep. That's going to be important for this next step. So the next step is I'm going to go to my level 2, and I actually want to make the beam systems that are going to kind of hold up this floor. Beams work exactly the same way as columns. They're just obviously horizontal, or they could be slanted or whatever. But I can go ahead and click on beam, and again I only have a couple options here, or actually one, and then I can do my load family. I can go to structural framing, and again you've got all your different materials. Again, I'm going to choose steel and all these different shapes. I go back down to the trusty W section, and I'll pick let's do it 12 by 65, and I'll just do one more, a 16 by 36. Those are, and 31. Those are pretty standard. And now I'll click OK, and yes, we'll override it. And then the way beams work is basically you just draw a line. So I'm going to draw a line from this column to this other column, and it makes the beam. Now it makes the beam at the floor line, so that's why I measured that distance of, or the depth of that structure. And so next time what I can do is actually click on that, and where you have start level offset and end level offset, I can just type in -5 inches on each. And the reason there's two, a start and an end, is you could, if I clicked on that, I could actually make my end level like 2 feet, and it'll slope my beam.
You start the beam from the flange or the middle of the web?
It doesn't matter. It trims to the column.
Okay.
So when I actually snapped to the center of the column lines when I did that, but your beam is actually going to be smart enough to actually snap to that and trim. Another thing that's nice about beams, real quick before I do the rest, is in 3D I can use the trim and extend commands. So right here under modify, I could actually extend just like you would a wall, I could extend the beam to another column. So you're kind of playing with sticks there. You're just kind of moving these things around. You can get them to align. I'm going to keep that one there. And so in order to make my system, I essentially have to go around and do that everywhere. And you probably want to turn in a wireframe and change my view range so I can see below the floor. And you'll notice that you can't see that beam again, and that's because I'm in a coarse level of view. So if I turn it to fine, then I see that beam again. Now, I just got done saying, well, if I want to place this beam everywhere, I have to keep doing that. I have to keep drawing over and over again. Well, typically what you would do is only draw the ones that are on the column grid. So I'm going to copy that now. And let me right-click on this and do create similar, and I'll do another one just on that part. I'm just going to frame out this section here. Make sure my... Oh, another thing I just forgot here. So the last time I lowered my beam, I did it by the start level offset and end level offset. I could also change the Z level or the Z offset value, and that will change the whole thing together. So that might be a better option for if you know your beam's going to be straight. So anyway, I'm going to frame that out. This will be the last thing here. But typically what you would have is then intermediate beams that are probably every 6 feet on center, because a composite deck in this case can't span greater than 6 feet. So usually you have 6 feet on center maximum or something like that. And so what you can do is we can actually go back to structure and choose a beam system instead. And we all know that we want to span the shortest distance, right? I'm going to go this way and this way. And if I click on automatic system, I can actually click, and you see all those dashed lines, it's going to produce a beam automatically at all those areas. Or I could do a sketch system, which would mean I could make whatever shape I want. So let's say I had, well, let's go ahead and just do that. Let's say I had a shape that did something like this instead. And obviously I would change my perimeter beams to match that. But let's just say I had something that was a little bit more non-orthogonal when we're kind of working with this. Before I hit the checkbox there's some options here. And the first is your layout rule is the fixed distance. So you can change, it's already set to 6 feet because they know that's typical standard. But you could change it if you really wanted it 4 feet or whatever you wanted. Or you could change it to fixed number or maximum spacing. But the other thing here is you can change what the beam type is going to be. So I'm going to choose 12 by 65. And then I'm going to click on the checkbox. Now it's going to draw in a beam that's associated with your boundary. And notice all my beams went in that direction. And that's not the way I wanted it to be. And that's because when I'm in my sketch, we have the little equal sign here. That's talking about your beam direction. If I click on beam direction up here and change it to this way, then all my beams run in that manner. Now, because they're a system, they're all kind of arrayed together, I can actually click on the system and I can change my elevation for all of those down to -5 inches, and that moves down. Now, obviously, I wouldn't do that particular system in that manner, but let me make it more correct. So this time I'm just going to do the beam system, and I'm going to use the sketch option. No, I didn't want the sketch, I'm sorry, the other option there. Automatic beam system. And I just hover over the horizontal, and there you go. And again, you have to kind of play around with the last part here. So you get an idea of, you could do that constantly, through all your different bays. Now this is only going to really work based on if you really have these orthogonal true structures that we typically have. If you have those complex structures like we went over in the last workshop, you're going to have to create some of your own structures like we did in that workshop to make that work. These things go straight. You can curve a beam. I could actually go into level 2 click on beam. So I could actually, do a couple beams here where, they curve. They can curve in that direction, and you can also curve them in, I believe, elevation. Have to be on a plane. So you can curve, in elevation as well. So you can start to do things like that for your systems. And all of these, again, like I said, I did it with W members. It could be any shape. Could be steel trusses. They have a bunch of structural framing trusses. All the structure stuff that's in there is everything that's out there. Well, pretty much everything that's out there is already come with Revit. So you can go ahead and have pretty realistic drawings so that you have the right model shape and everything, and you tell your professors that that's a W26 by whatever, and it's really going to be that if you used these members. So I really think it's kind of it on structures. I do have some additional videos on structures that I could, give to you guys or give you access to if you need to get any more complicated than that, but I can also help you guys through email if you guys, and I'm also coming in for other workshops. I'm not sure the structure of those. Initially, those were supposed to be 3 more visits where I either help you guys out like at your desk, or there's more of these type of sessions where I just cover things and you guys try to absorb it and watch the video. So we'll talk a little bit more. Maybe you guys can have that same conversation with Jefferson and Kelly and see what the next workshops will be, and we can kind of go from there. Any questions on any of this stuff? All right, I think that's about it.
Thank you.
All right.
Will you when you post this video,
Mm-hmm.
will you send out a link?
Yeah, what I've been doing is sending the link to Kelly and Jefferson, and they've been forwarding it to you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. It probably won't be posted until either Saturday or Sunday. If you guys are really jumping at the bit to watch it, it's going to be about that time.
Yeah.
Okay.